Okay, let's start if we can. Kind of working for time here. Make sure that we've got a quorum, and we did get one. So we'll call this to order, and with that, we'll have Ann call the roll for us, please.
Yes, sir. So, Reed, you're here.
Yep.
Dr. Cantu,
Here.
John Agatha,
I'm here.
Anakwa Garcia, Councilwoman Villagran,
Here.
Peter. Here. I've seen you. Andy Castillo, yes, sir. Al. Here. Michael Kinnick. Anne Marie. Jack.
Here.
Wayne. Tony Edwards. Michael Sanchez.
Here.
Dee Dee. I see your name up there. Dee Dee, you're on mute if you're trying to say here. Kurt, I don't believe he's going to be out of town, I believe.
I know Kurt's not coming. We'll deem Dee Dee here.
Okay, yes, sir. Yes, sir, I did. Christopher. Dr. Femi? I believe he's the calling user as well.
I heard him earlier. I don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Dana will not be here. Jim? Oh, and Anita?
Here.
Okay. We do have a quorum, and we have been called to order. I'm going to make a couple of announcements, and then I'll have a few comments after our public comment. We have moved the podium that was back there. So anyone that comes to speak, please come up here so everybody can see them. That was a good comment that I got, and got that straightened out. Okay, we'll now have the invocation.
Good afternoon. Let's bow our heads. We thank you for the many blessings you've freely given to each of us. We ask for your presence to guide this meeting of the Rate Advisory Committee. Provide them with the knowledge, compassion, and wise counsel needed as they discuss the business matters on the agenda today. Help us all to remember that we are stewards acting on behalf of our customers, and provide us with the grace to serve all people well. We also ask for those who are in mourning today, who are grieving the loss of many loved ones. And we ask that you would give them the peace and the comfort that is needed in these difficult times. In your name, amen.
Thank you, Mr. Reyes. Okay, we'll have the public input now, and if the folks that are speaking, have we figured out that we can get this on the camera, or it just they want to come here? Yeah, come on up here, whoever's speaking. Here, that doesn't work.
Hi, my name is Christopher Mayorga. I'm here to comment on CPS Energy's proposal to convert Spruce 2 to a natural gas power plant. I encourage every one of you to read the handout I submitted called The False Promise of Natural Gas, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2020. While natural gas has been propped up as a cleaner transition fuel from coal to renewables, we must remember that this gas is still a fossil fuel composed mostly of methane, which contributes to climate change and is hazardous to human health, as stated by the authors. A natural gas conversion would also be unwise from an economic standpoint. Today, Spruce is one of the last remaining coal plants in the country. Does CPS Energy really want to stay behind the curve by clinging to polluting fuels? The cost of producing energy from renewables is falling rapidly. The Energy Information Administration estimates that by 2023, it'll cost $36.60 per megawatt hour to produce electricity from wind, and $37 to produce solar energy, versus $40 to produce energy from gas. If we want affordable energy, we have to invest in renewable energy. And if you've been told that wind and solar are not reliable, please do some research into batteries. Batteries have become so advanced that they can power electric vehicles, which can be plugged into people's homes and buildings and provide power back to the grid. Just last week, San Antonio hosted the Clean Power Conference. One of the biggest takeaways from it was that increasing storage capacity could allow operators to store solar energy produced midday in batteries and send that power to the grid when demand is highest, typically in the evening. The price of batteries is also rapidly falling. The investments planned for environmental compliance for the Spruce coal plant could be rerouted into energy storage. I encourage you all to use your voice on the rack to tell the board we need to move away from natural gas and start investing in renewables to leave a better world for the next generation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right, just a couple of comments before I turn it over to Benny and Kevin. What we're going to see today is a kind of a two-step process. First, we've as y'all remember, we went through the first step to look historically as to what we were using and how we were using it. And we've asked them to kind of update that information, put the ancillary services in there with the energy production. So we've got both of those in there now. And so the first thing is to really talk about what we have and how we've been using it. The second part of the day will basically be taking these elements and looking at them as building blocks for scenarios, okay? Now we're in any planning, you're going to have many scenarios because you're going to have different elements that you use to approach it, and you're going to have different assumptions and different, and within assumptions, you're going to have a whole range of values. So the second part of the day will be just looking at the building blocks and the time frame. And the time frame we're looking here is basically to 2030. So you got to think about what we're trying to do and then what we're trying to do in the time frame that we've got to do it. And Benny will talk about the constraints that we have on the time frame and why we have to do it by 2030. Now, after we do that, we will then the last time around, we will get your input. Well, we'll ask you to ask questions after the first one if there's any questions, because this is a little bit of a review because we did have to stop, get on the step, and now we're back on this. So the first presentation is a bit of a review, but that's okay. It'll bring all of us up to the same place. And then after we do the second presentation, when we're going to go around and we're going to ask people what they'd like, where they'd like to see this at the end of those 7 years, at 2030. Where do we want to be? Because there's many ways you can get there. But the idea of what we're going to do and where we're going to be there needs input, obviously, from you folks. So without anything else, let me just turn it over to Benny and let he and Kevin get started.
Thank you, Reed. Good afternoon, folks. I know we have some new members. I'm Benny Etheridge, and I lead the energy supply group for CPS Energy. And that entails our power generation group along with our market operations and fuel procurement. So we've got everything bundled up in one place. Really appreciate your support in this effort. I'll tell you today that Kevin has two good presentations, as Reed indicated, that lay out a little bit of history and discuss building blocks. Okay, we've talked about options, we've talked about scenarios, building blocks. That's just what they are. We've heard you'd like to see an option without Spruce 2 in the future, period, even without Spruce 2 and natural gas. Those are the kind of things we want to firm up with you all when we get your input and we do this modeling. So this is a great opportunity to hear from you. We want to lay this information out here and set the foundation to get the discussion going, but we're looking for your input here. We absolutely need to hear from you. Kevin, let me turn it over to you and you can walk through these presentations.
Thank you, Benny. Again, for those who may not know me, I'm Kevin Paulo, Vice President for Energy Supply and Market Operations for CPS Energy, and happy to be back in front of you to talk about our generation planning efforts for this year. We'll go through the generation utilization deck will be the first one. Do I have control? All right. I'm not sure that I do. The infamous power button. All right, so today with this first presentation, I want to talk a little bit about peak planning, you know, how we have, what strategy we've used as we do our capacity planning over the years and how that applies to the efforts we're going through this summer. We'll talk a little bit about reserve margin, again, how that plays into peak planning. And we'll finish with, again, going back and updating some of the conversation we had a couple months ago about utilization statistics for our plants, how we utilize those plants in the market, both for, we focused on energy last time, realized that didn't provide, I think, the complete picture. So we wanted to circle back and talk about ancillary services and why that is important from a planning perspective as well. You know, starting off, when you look at electricity and how it's generated, how it's used in the market, it is a bit unique in the sense that it's generally produced and consumed in real time. Storage, as we've talked about, is continuing to make a larger impact on the overall ERCOT market. So we are able to produce some energy, you know, store it, utilize it later, but that has not gotten to the point yet where it really meets the largest percentage of need for the market or for CPS Energy. So we're still largely producing and consuming energy in real time. So that's a balance that's struck, you know, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And when, you know, as a utility for CPS Energy, if we're short, you know, in terms of our generation capacity versus our needs, that can have a significant financial impact for our customers. If the market, ERCOT, becomes short, again, as we all learned with Winter Storm Uri, then you get severe reliability consequences. This slide shows kind of our peak demand, peak obligations versus our capacity. So, you know, the stack bar that you see is our generation capacity. So we've broken kind of the major fuel types up, you know, starting with nuclear on the bottom in the dark blue, renewables in purple. So you can see over the last 20 years or so, I guess this is 10 years, how we've grown our renewable fleet. You know, we started adding wind in the early 2000s and then have grown both our wind profile and our solar profile. We show coal in yellow above that, and then the green is all of our different natural gas technologies. If you look at the diamond, that's basically our load obligations, just our energy. The star above that is the ancillary services that are added to that. So both energy and ancillary services are an obligation for our customers. So we have the option, if you will, of generating or having capacity under contract to meet those obligations, or we buy it from the market. That applies to energy. It also applies to ancillary services. As I said, we didn't cover ancillary services a lot, so that's one of the things we wanted to really introduce with today's discussion. So you do see that on top of the star and all these snapshots in time, we do have some excess capacity above the ancillary services. Part of that is what we call our reserve margin. We'll talk more about reserve margin as well. Thank you, Reed. So I'm going to move to slide 5 right now. So slide 5 here, this shows a typical summer day. We've shown, you know, kind of a load or a demand projection for the year 2025. So that's important because that kind of marks the end of phase 1, if you will, of our transformation, and that's flex power bundle. So what this slide is showing is that our 3 Browning units will have been retired. So those have been removed from the capacity equation. And what we've added in is the 900 megawatts of solar, the 50 megawatts of energy storage, and our 500 megawatts of firming capacity. So that's why we chose 2025 for this view. What you see, and so that's, you know, kind of the dark blue lines, that's that total capacity that you see. It varies from hour to hour because that's the effect of the renewables, right? We don't wind or solar obviously doesn't produce overnight. So the reason why your capacity in the middle of the day is so much higher than overnight is because of that added solar capacity. Again, the lines that you see, the bottom line is our load obligation, our projected load, and then the top line represents our 13.75% reserve margin. What we've shown in orange, the orange circle, is what we would get, what we call our average peak. So by average, that refers to what we call weather normalized. So if you take kind of the average weather that you would expect to occur over the summer, average temperatures based over the last 30 years, you get, based on those temperatures, that's where we see that orange circle. What we call the stress peak, or that purple diamond, is kind of where that load would go, that peak load would go if we have hotter than normal temperatures. And so you see a pretty big jump in summer between that normal or average peak and what we call our stress peak. So we do think it is important, again, based on, we'll talk about winter on the next slide. But as you look at what we expect from an average peak versus the stress peak, we do think from a capacity planning perspective, it is important to look at what might happen in those more stressful weather conditions. And just for perspective, that average peak that we're showing of a little over 5,400 megawatts, our current all-time record is 5,157 megawatts. So you do see some load growth. We'll talk more about that later on in the second presentation. But we are a growing community, and you'll see, that means we have an expectation that our load needs will continue to grow over time. I do want to point out, when you look at the supply, you see different percentages. Nuclear, coal, gas, storage, we show as 100% contributing to the peak. That's, again, they're controllable, they're dispatchable, and we can control those resources, what they produce, when they produce it. You see different percentages for wind and solar, and that's by nature of how wind and solar work. The percentages that we use for wind, we follow the methodology that ERCOT uses. And so basically for coastal wind, for example, we're showing 57%. So what that means is if you have a wind farm that's 100 megawatts, we count 57 megawatts, 57% of that to the peak hour. And that's based on, ERCOT does a study looking at the 20 highest load hours throughout a summer and how much wind is producing during those 20 hours, those 20 highest load hours. That's where that 57% comes from. So it's historically based on the way wind is actually produced, generated in the market. West wind is a little different. West wind tends to, yes, sir. Great question. When I say peak hours, the question was, when I use the word peak, am I talking about peak production hours or peak load hours? When I'm using the term peak, it is our load. So CPS Energy's highest load throughout the day. So generally for us, as you can see where the bars, it's what we call hour ending 19. So 7 o'clock at night. So that hour from 6 to 7 o'clock at night, people are getting home from work, turning on the air conditioners. That's when we see the highest load for CPS Energy historically. So that's my definition, if you will, of the word peak. It's on the load side. With solar, again, you can see again through the earlier parts of the day, our capacity line is higher. That's when solar is producing at its greatest output. As we've looked at the data from our solar plants, the ones that we have under contract and look, again, typically at that hour, 6 to 7 o'clock at night, they're only producing at about half of what their full output capability is. That's where our 50% comes from. Again, it's historically based on how the solar farms produce. And so again, when you get into those peak hours, those peak demand hours, we're generally relying on all of our resources, to meet that demand. This slide shows a similar view, but it shows winter. And again, what you see, similar layout. So again, the lines that go through the 24 hours is our load. So this load and our 13.75% reserve margin is significantly less than what we saw on the summer slide. And that's because typically our winter peak demand is much lower than in summer. But you see, if you look at the little call out box to the right, The stress peak, though, becomes very different. We see a much bigger jump, if you will, between the weather normalized, our average weather, and that stress weather, more extreme weather. We see a bigger change in our load demands in winter. What we saw, again, with Winter Storm Uri, we set a new all-time peak winter record. It was a little over 4,900 megawatts. We do think, again, had there not been the load curtailments, that we would have exceeded our summer peak during that winter event. So we see a bigger shift in winter. You see a different shift a little bit in the capacity, again, or what lines up over peak. You know, our peak hour, load hour in winter occurs earlier, hour ending 8, you know, again in the morning as people are getting up, getting ready for school, getting ready for work. And we see a much lower contribution from solar at that hour. So it performs differently for us in winter versus summer. This slide, I talked a little bit about reserve margin, but when we talk about reserve margin, again, that's the amount of excess capacity. Thank you, Reed. I'm sorry, slide 7. You may have to remind me. I'll try to do better. But so this slide, on slide 7, we're showing reserve margin. And so that is, if you take what our total load is, total load demand versus our total generating capacity, the amount of generation that we have that exceeds what we need to serve our load, if you will, we call our reserve margin. There is a reason why we intend to have reserve margin, why we plan for that. But you can see historically, going back to 2015, the number varies over time. Some of that is, you know, based on how we add generation. Typically, as we're adding a generation resource, whether it be under a contract or whether it be something that we have built or purchased, it adds, you know, the full capacity gets added into our portfolio at one time, even though our need for it in terms of load may be 1 or 2 or 3 years later. Part of that is just the nature of how the construction timeline, or when the unit, like when we purchased Rio Nogales, it became available a little bit in advance of when we were intending to, or when we actually did shut down the dealer units. But we had to make that acquisition, so we had the capacity available when we retired the dealer units. So that's why you see, for example, in that 2016 timeframe, you know, we jumped well above that 13.75% planning number that I talked about. But you can see it varies. We see, again, another kind of increase over time in the mid-2020s. Again, that's the nature of adding the flex power bundle. We want to add the solar, the storage, the firming capacity before we actually retire the Browning units. So that's why for a couple of years, as we're adding that capacity, we see the reserve margin go up. As the Browning units then retire, we see that jump down, you know, between 2025, 2026. But as the box to the right talks about, we use that reserve margin. Part of that is the capacity that we use to fulfill our ancillary service obligations. Part of that, again, is capacity that we have available to meet our demand if our power plants generate less. So some of that is maintenance. We may have units that need planned maintenance or that decide on a given day they're not ready to play. You know, they hit the injured list, so to speak. So we have that excess or that reserve margin to fill in those cases. Sometimes our load grows quicker than we forecasted, so that reserve margin becomes important to continue to meet our needs over the long-term horizon. Moving to slide 8, just again, we'll kind of transition the rest of the discussion and talk a little bit more about the specific utilization factors. So I did want to talk about some of the drivers. When we talk about utilization, we did talk about and showed some statistics and some charts to this group in January. So some of this will be a little bit of a review and then an update on that information we shared before. But when we look at the ERCOT market, it's really a significant driver in the utilization of our power plants is actually what the market price is. You know, our units will run or dispatch between minimum output and maximum output based on the power price in the market. And that becomes important for us so that the way we essentially protect our customers from exposure to high market prices is by having capacity available to meet their needs. So again, as power prices go up, our units will ramp up to full load capability. And so our customers then effectively pay the price, the production cost of our units, the fuel cost and and other variable costs of our units to produce power. So we cap, essentially our customers, what they're paying for energy at the cost of running our power plants. As market prices drop, our utilization may drop as well, but in that case, we're able to buy power from the ERCOT market at a price that's cheaper than buying it from or producing it from our own generating unit. So ultimately, our customers benefit in that case, but we're still protecting them based on the maximum price of power or production cost to produce the power ourselves. When you look at ancillary services, again, that's capacity that's needed that ERCOT uses to help respond to changing grid conditions. So when you have something that affects generation, you have a generating unit that may trip, for example, that has an impact on frequency. One of the things that ERCOT has to do is maintain frequency right at 60 hertz again, so you don't see your light bulbs, for example, dim or a surge, to the point that you damage, equipment and stuff. So maintaining that 60 hertz is very critical for the grid. The way ERCOT does that is through ancillary services. They procure generating capacity from generators like us to help provide different services to respond to frequency shifts. So switching to slide 9, this kind of shows a graphic, but if you look, this was taken from some ERCOT material. So if you look at the bar labeled system demand, so at any given point in the day, ERCOT is balancing demand and supply. So that's where you see the system demand line. So they make sure that there's enough capacity online to meet that demand, but then they also ensure there's excess capacity that they pay for. So that again, as you see things happen that affect generation availability, ERCOT will deploy, if you will, some of that capacity that's reserved. There's 4 different types of ancillary services, but it's used either as kind of immediate frequency correction versus if you have a large unit, for example, that trips, it has a bigger effect on frequency, and so ERCOT will actually release some additional capacity to help fill in that gap that was created when that unit tripped offline. That becomes important for us because as a load, we have an obligation essentially to pay for our portion of the ancillary services. So we're typically about 7% of the ERCOT load. So in ERCOT, they run their studies and they determine there's a certain number of megawatts of ancillary services that they need to ensure the grid stays reliable. And so they will basically charge our load 7% of that cost. They pay the generators for that reserve capacity, and then they charge loads like us to pay for it. Since we are a generator as well, we have the option of providing that ancillary service off of our generating units instead of paying ERCOT. We can self-serve, if you will, but that becomes capacity. We need to have capacity not only to meet the energy needs of our community, but also that 7% share of ancillary services. Either way, we look at having that capacity available, again, to protect our customers from being exposed to whatever the price of power may be on the ERCOT market. We protect it at the cost of our generation. I did also want to show, I think we've shown this slide before, but when you look at how we build our portfolio to meet our customer needs, our load it's not a flat load throughout the day. So again, this is a typical summer profile. The line that's labeled market price and load shows how our load typically works throughout a summer day. You start low overnight, it ramps up, reaches its peak level during the middle of the afternoon, and then ramps back down. Again, I moved on to slide 10 for those folks who are on the WebEx. Market prices in ERCOT tend to follow that load shape pretty closely as well. So again, lower prices overnight, and you see higher prices throughout the middle of the peak part of the afternoon. Again, that time from about 4 in the afternoon till 7 in the afternoon. So we build a portfolio with different types of generators, some that we call base load that are intended to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Those are the ones, like our nuclear units. Coal is considered a base load, and even our combined cycle units like Rio Nogales and AVR. Those will have higher utilization because they're intended to run essentially around the clock. We have other units like our Milton B. Lee peaking units that we don't intend to run around the clock. We intend to run them during the peak hours of the day and the highest load days of the year. And so as you see from this graphic, basically use those different types of technologies and kind of build a portfolio around that. You know, the trade-off, if you will, when you look at base load, that's typically a higher capital cost in terms of total dollars spent to build a base load generator, but they generally have lower variable fuel cost in terms of what it costs to produce a megawatt hour of energy on any given day. A peaking unit kind of works the opposite, much lower capital cost to build the unit, but then it typically has a higher fuel cost. So that's kind of the trade-off that we look at in terms of how we build that total portfolio. So the point again, as we get to utilization, kind of by design, our units are intended to have different percentages of utilization throughout the year. This chart, as I move to slide 11, kind of shows what we typically would expect for those different types of generators. So again, from a peaking type unit, typically to produce energy, we expect utilization anywhere from 5%, up to maybe 25%. We frequently use those to carry ancillary services, and you can see as you look down the table, base load is kind of exactly the opposite, right? It's intended to run, or expected utilization is very high, 75 to 100%, or close to 100%. But we may not be able to use, or our ancillary service use may be very limited depending on the resource. For example, our nuclear units typically have a very high utilization, but they're intended to run at basically full load 24 hours a day, and they don't ramp up and down well, so we don't use those to provide ancillary services. Again, a combined cycle unit can run as a base load generator. It's much more flexible in the market. It can ramp up and down very quickly, and so we do tend to use those to carry some ancillary services. So again, it's important, I think, from our perspective, the different types of fuel, different fuel types and different generation types between base load and peaking all come together to build this portfolio that we use to serve our load. Slide 12, this is an update to the utilization table that we showed you all in January. In January, we showed you kind of a 4-year history over the last 4 years of what our utilization has been. For this update, we singled out the most recent year, 2021. So what you'll see in the dark blue lines, that's the amount of time that each generating unit produced energy. Over the course of 24 hours a day, 365 days a year being your 100% level. The dark blue shows how much of that, what percentage of that year was spent producing energy. Again, some of that will be driven by our intended use of the different types of generators, some of it dictated by market prices. And what we filled in, so we showed that similar view of the dark blue in January. What we filled in was the orange line. We did not show that last time. And I thought it was important to circle back and add that because that shows again, throughout the course of that year, what percentage of the year was that generator capacity obligated to provide, obligated meaning we chose to carry ancillary services on it, but what percentage of the year was that generator actually providing ancillary services and meeting that part of the financial obligation of our load? So you see, again, particularly with our peaking units, a very dramatic change in utilization between energy only and energy plus ancillary services. So let me pause. Michael, I see you have a question, sir.
Yeah, as long as we're on this slide, I'll ask a question that I would have asked later anyhow. If Spruce 2 was converted to gas, which of these categories was it likely to be in? Would it still be baseload or would it shift to one of these other areas?
I think our view as we look at how Spruce 2 would operate as a natural gas-fired generator would likely move out of the baseload category. It would be more intermediate. I think it'd look more along the lines, not exactly like Summers, but closer to the Summers 1 and Summers 2 profiles than it does as a coal unit.
Thank you.
So kind of finishing here on slide 13, just some of the key takeaways as we look at this. Again, our strategy over the years from a generation planning perspective has been to ensure that we have enough capacity to protect our customers from exposure to market prices. As market prices move up, we want to ensure that we're trying to cap our customers' cost at the production cost of our own generation. And so that means we have to have capacity to meet not only our peak energy needs, but also the ancillary service needs at the same time. We think it's been important to have a diversity, both not only in terms of fuel, but in terms of the types of generators, base load versus peaking, for example. And when you look at ancillary services, I know we haven't talked a lot about that in the past, but that becomes, it's a vital source of supply for ERCOT in terms of maintaining grid reliability. You know, again, it's excess capacity that they reserve every hour of the day to be able to call on when needed as conditions change. You know, maybe a few degrees hotter than folks forecasted, so load might be higher on a given day. That capacity that's reserved becomes important to fill in that gap. Generating unit trips, again, that capacity is used by ERCOT to help fill in that gap. For us, as I said, it's a financial obligation that our customers have, and so we have the luxury, if you will, of being not only a load but also a generator of self-serving the ancillary services, as opposed to just having to pay our 7% share of the financial cost. And then again, reserve margin is an important concept to help, again, provide protection against market exposure as things change on our end, load forecasts, load growth throughout the city, you know, or availability of our generating units. And I think as we look at generation planning, reserve margin, for example, I think is a very important potential topic of debate. Is 13.75% the right number? Should we have a higher reserve margin? Should we have a lower reserve margin? I think those are some key questions for us to potentially look at as we work through you know, our generation planning activities over the next several months. So with that, I'd like to pause and see if there's any questions or. Okay, I'll just, the appendix. Okay, I'll stop here, Reed, if it's all right with you. Wayne had a question.
Just a quick question. What is a sunk cost for Spruce 2? In other words, if it's $50 million plan to take it down, to start building it back up, or we're taking it down to like 30 million and then build it back up to 55, what is a sunk cost to tear it down, to start over, to rebuild it?
So I'm going to look to Benny or Corey to help provide that answer on the numbers. What I would say is there's a couple of options. If we looked at completely retiring Spruce 2, for example, then that sunk cost or that residual value has to be considered. If we look at converting it, then not the entire residual value of the plant isn't lost. It's only the coal-specific you know, components of the plant that become unusable at that point. Let me turn it over to Benny.
Okay, Corey, did you want to speak to?
I can, just on the numbers. So I don't have them handy on me, but I've quoted them before. I think actually we were doing a editorial board online thing with Diego and the San Antonio Express. There's about $1 billion or so that we've spent on Spruce 1 and 2, and that breaks out. Spruce 2 has most of the cost. It's 6, 7, 800 million. We'll come back with the exact numbers. Then there's a little bit that's shared facilities that share between 1 and 2. But very much like Kevin said, to the extent that we have to make an investment to repurpose it and you still get use out of it in the future, it's not sunk in the sense that, well, it's still providing revenue back to you to pay off the existing debt. Because the money we spent, it's not sunk. Cash went out the door, but we still owe debt, right? So whether it's running or not running, we're paying the debt that exists on Spruce 1 or 2, like that period. So whatever the decision the community makes, we have to accept. There are bonds out there. Somehow they got to get paid. And if you can repurpose the asset and it can generate dollars back, great. And then that means it's going to just pay off that debt. If you don't, and you just completely shut down both of them, well, somehow the community is going to have to still pay off the debt that's owed on those plants. So hopefully that helps a little bit. And we'll go into more detail, you know, if we prepare something, but that's the real gist. We had to borrow all that money, you know, $1 billion for Spruce 2 to pay for it, but we got, you know, 2 decades of commitment on paying that debt out over time.
I could probably add just a little bit more to that. As Corey said, around $1 billion right now. If we do a gas conversion, about 75% of that facility will be able to continue to use, which was the point Corey was making.
About 25% down, but otherwise we'd have to go all the way to ground zero to start. But now we only go down 25 to take it back up to where we need to be at.
Yes, sir.
That's what I was asking. Thank you very much.
That's correct.
I have a question. This is Adelita Cantu.
Yeah,
Are you going in order, Reed?
let's, let's let them get finished, and then we'll go through the questions so that I don't miss anyone. If we can, I want everybody to see these last few pages, because they might have some questions on that, and then we'll go through and get everybody. Well, I'll make sure we get everybody. I've already had 3 texts that they want to talk, so trust me, I'm on notice. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So I'll move to the appendix slides. We'll start with slide 16. This is just a listing of our what we call our conventional technology. So we list the name of the unit, kind of our acronym, capacity by unit. And the important thing for this conversation is we list not only the fuel type, but the type of generator that we considered. Again, base load versus intermediate versus a peaking generator. On slide 17 is a list of our renewable resources. Again, name of the resource, our capacity. That capacity at summer peak is an important number. Again, it's different, as I showed you with the percentages. It's different from the maximum capacity because, again, wind and solar are typically not producing their maximum output at the hour of the day when our load is highest, our peak load. So what we've shown is the capacity that we count, if you will, towards that summer peak load. The percentages you see at the table there at the top right, again, similar table to what we showed on the other slide. The one difference being we added landfill gas here on this appendix table. And you see our total, the summary there on the bottom right, total by fuel type in terms of the renewables, and then the total summer capacity that we count towards that peak hour. On slide 18 is just a little bit more in depth on the types of ancillary services that ERCOT uses. The regulation reserve, that corrects, if you will, small frequency changes in ERCOT. So you actually are using that regulation reserve every 4 seconds in ERCOT. Responsive reserve is held for larger changes in frequency. And so ERCOT will typically start releasing that responsive reserve again when there's a more significant unit trip or other grid conditions that start affecting frequency to a much larger impact. And then non-spin is, again, reserve capacity that ERCOT holds and then starts to release as their reserves become tighter. Particularly the last 2, responsive reserve, non-spin reserve, ERCOT uses those to essentially try to prevent, the need to shed load. Do you want me to run through the rest? I know you want to want to work through different questions. Okay. Thank you. Good question. Frequency is 60 hertz. Good question.
Let's run through them real quick.
And then slide 19 is a definition of each of those ancillary services that I just briefly spoke of. So I gave you kind of the Cliff Notes version. Slide 19 goes into a little bit more detail on each of those ancillary services. Slide 20 is utilization by month. We showed you on the one slide that had the blue and the orange, the full year view. This is how it changes by month. You can see different variations between January, February, for example, deeper into winter versus your spring and fall months, and then summer being another high utilization period. This is just the energy side. And then slide 21, similar monthly view, but this is showing by unit what we use for ancillary services. And then slide 22 is, again, the total utilization, so energy plus ancillary services. Slide 23 is just a view. This was actually taken from a couple of summer days in 2019 and a couple of winter days in 2019. That week in the summer of 2019 is significant because that was the last time we had energy emergency alerts in ERCOT during summer. We did not get all the way to load shed during those summer days, but we did actually get into an energy emergency alert. And part of what you see and what's important is the variation, particularly in wind. So solar is the dark green, wind is the lighter green around that. And you can see at periods of the day, wind during that week really dropped out. That was one of the main contributors as to why we got into those energy emergency alerts. On certain days, the days that we did not have the energy emergency alerts, ERCOT wind was around 8,000 megawatts across the peak hour. And on the days where we did get into the energy emergency alerts, wind was only contributing between about 2,000 and 4,000 megawatts. So again, that difference is enough on those high load days in ERCOT potentially to be, the difference between having enough reserves to make it through the day and less, and much more tight reserve conditions where you do have potential challenges to grid reliability. So that should be the last slide there. So I'll pause and turn it back over to Reed.
Just hang right here. Okay, I'm going to take the list as it's on the where she calls the roll, so that way nobody thinks I'm trying to. I'll get everybody. Okay, the first one on the list is Dr. Cantu. You're on.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is just probably easy definition. When some of your slides say summer, what is the definition of summer in terms of months? Are you looking at what we traditionally think of June, July, August? Are you going earlier, May and April, since we know that the climate is changing, we're going to get heat sooner? How are you looking at that, and does that affect your projections?
For the purposes of these slides and looking at the peak demand, I would say summer is typically going to be July and August in terms of that's when we typically see our highest load. From a planning perspective, we treat, I think, May through September as our summer period.
Okay.
Typically, those higher loads, like I said, occur in either July or August.
Thank you. And then on slide number 9, I thought I heard you say something, so I just wanted to be sure I heard it correctly. Slide number 9 was talking about at times that we may buy energy from ERCOT, and there are sometimes we don't. You said it was something along the lines of buying from ERCOT, sometimes we don't, and we don't go to ERCOT. Could you further explain that, please?
Yes, I think that may have been more on slide 8. So
Maybe slide 8, okay.
I switched the view here in the room to slide 8.
Okay.
It has to do with kind of where ERCOT market prices are. And so there'll be periods of the day and periods, certain days of the year, for example, when there's a lot of generation online, for example, whether it's wind, solar, obviously, or other generating units. And as market prices become lower, we let our units, if you will, ramp down or choose not to run a particular unit because it's cheaper for us on those days or those hours to buy the ERCOT, to buy the energy from ERCOT. It's a lower cost for our customers than it would be for us to kind of force our units to run at a higher load level. Those units are available and they will ramp up as prices move up. The units will ramp up and produce up to maximum load. So that, again, when it becomes cheaper for us to run those units than to buy from ERCOT, that's what we want to do, is we want to have our units produce power for our community. So the most we're paying, or the most our customers are paying, is the cost to run our own generating units. If it's cheaper for us to buy from ERCOT, we like to do that because it ultimately is a lower bill impact for our community.
And how are those decisions made? Is it pretty real time? I mean, we're looking at the plants that you've ramped down and then say, let's go to ERCOT and buy energy. So time-wise, is that pretty much real time when it happens, when those decisions are made?
Yes, ma'am. It's generally real time. In some cases, maybe the day ahead. With certain units that have a longer startup time, we have to make the decision generally the day ahead to bring that unit online so that it's available the next day when we expect higher loads and higher prices. But we make those decisions primarily, particularly with our units that are very flexible. We make those decisions, as you said, real time, so that we have the most current information available for our team to make those decisions with.
Thank you.
I mentioned you buy and sell ancillary services. It's not a free thing. Yeah.
Yes, Reed had a comment again on ancillary services. We can do a similar thing. We have If it's going to be cheaper for us to buy an ancillary service from ERCOT or from someone else in the market, a third party, we'll do that. If it's cheaper for us to buy that ancillary service than it would be for us to bring a unit online to have available to provide that ancillary service. So we make that same buy or versus produce decision both with energy and with ancillary services.
Okay. Did that answer your questions, Dr.
Yes,
Cantor?
thank you. Thank you, Reed.
All right. The next in line is John Agather. John, do you have any questions? Okay. Maybe we'll come back. Maybe he's got it turned off. Okay. Council, let's see. No. Let's see. Nakwa Garcia? Nakwa?
Yes.
Go
Hello.
ahead.
I wanted to bring back the discussion around the costs associated with closing down the Spruce coal plant, if I can, since it was brought up. I am wondering if these costs also factor in the looming EPA designation and what that will incur on us, as well as the health effects and impacts on the community that they incur in terms of coal ash pollution. And I think Dr. Cantu can speak more on that. And I'm just wondering if those are factored in on the cost of shutting down Spruce. Thank you.
If I'm getting your question right, you're saying that we need to impute a cost, obviously, from environmental cost. So if you shut it down, you're avoiding that cost. That's your question, if I got it right?
Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, correct. If we, excuse me, if we did not continue to run Spruce on coal, then we would avoid an ELG project, effluent limitation guideline project, roughly $60 million. Spruce 1 would require an SCR, and that's another $150 million. So those would be the costs out there if we wanted to continue coal operation on those units. Obviously, those would be avoided if we discontinued coal operation on those units. Is that where you were looking to go?
I guess more specifically, the cost associated with the pollution from the coal plants.
Yeah, these are what we call external costs, or costs that are exported but not imputed into our books. So those costs are not calculated in what he's talking about. No. Typically, they're called externalities, but the externalities are not in here economically, the term.
Yeah, there's nothing I can really.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, another question there, Nanako? Okay. Councilwoman Villagrán? Councilwoman Villagrán?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
That's okay.
I like someone else would like to see when we talk about that 75%, 25%, do we know how much that is going to kind of help in our what impact that's going to have on the air quality that we've been talking about? Do we have that information or have an idea of what that's going to look like?
Okay, let me just make sure which 25 and 75 you're talking about.
So so right now they're saying 75% if we convert the Spruce over to natural gas, we can use 75% of that. Of the plant is still usable.
Councilwoman, this is Rudy Garza. I understand where you're going with that question. We can work with ACOG on the modeling. associated with our air quality. ACOG typically does the air modeling for us that ends up working its way through the EPA process for designation. And factor in what our air, what our standards look like if you remove spruce 1 and spruce 2 from the equation as coal units. So we'll work with the right folks to get those models run. But I know what you're asking for, and we'll figure that out.
Okay, thank you. That was my only question right now. Thank you.
Well, and also, as a shorthand, as you convert something, if you use it at the same level from coal to gas, the shorthand is about half the pollutants, just as a shorthand, okay? The 75% is a financial answer as to how much of the value of the plant is still there. If you have to take the coal chutes off and that kind of stuff. But the reality is, from a new capital standpoint, if I understood Benny right, it's going to cost us about 48 and we're going to save 60 something. So there's really actually a new capital savings that would offset some of that loss in value as you convert the plant of stuff that you would not be able to use. Is there anything else, Councilwoman?
No, that was it for now. Thank you, Reed.
Sure. Peter.
Thank you,
I
Reed.
saw him here. Yeah, go ahead.
And thank you for the presentation, Kevin. And I also appreciate the time you took to address our inquiries during our generation planning subcommittee. And one of the items that we had requested was revisiting the utilization presentation you did in January, which you presented today. So thanks again for that. Good information. I have a comment and a question. During our subcommittee meetings, we talked about the value of having a diversified generation portfolio. And if I could use a sports analogy, how you utilize this portfolio is, I liken it to a basketball team where you have your starters, bench players, role players, and the coach manages those players' time to optimize a successful outcome. So one of your star generation portfolio players, although it has some baggage and is somewhat expensive, is natural gas. So my question is, based on your generation modeling and forecasting, of course, the model we had was very simple, and I know you all have very sophisticated models, but based on your modeling and forecasting, can you explain how and why natural gas can serve as an economically viable bridge in our transition to greener fuel, and how we would optimize our current power plants over the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a great question. We'll certainly, I think, talk about that as well in the next presentation a bit. But I think as we look at the transformation of our fleet, there are certain generators, 2 Spruce units, 2 Summers units, the 3 Bronick units, that we know or we expect decisions and action to be made or needed in the next, by the end of the decade, right? And so I think as we look at different types of emerging technologies, there's a lot of things that we're very excited about, whether it be geothermal, whether it be newer types of batteries that offer longer duration storage. There's other types of extended duration storage that we think are emerging or are very exciting. I think one of the things that is important for us, though, will be timing. Not all of those resources are kind of commercially viable or at least have a large presence in the industry right now. So as we look at what I would call our immediate transition, right? What do we need to do in the next 8 years over the course of the next decade? Natural gas, I think, provides some opportunities that are readily available, certainly with Flex Power Bundle and the timing of those first retirements with the Bronick units. I think we look at my view is natural gas, as I said, is readily available. There's units in ERCOT that we're looking to contract with, and that provides an immediate bridge that helps to get us through that next 5, possibly 10 years. As we look then at bringing capacity on at the end of the decade, for the Summers and potentially the Spruce units, I think some of those other technologies are likely to potentially be available already by then, so to speak. I think when you look at the longer term picture and what we're going to have to do by 2050 to meet the climate action and adaptation plan goals, every generating unit that we have is going to need to have a decision made on it between now and 2050. And I think as you get deep past this immediate transition and past these next 8 years, I think a lot of things on the load side, demand side, opportunities I think will become more readily available. I think there'll be more options available to us with these emerging technologies in terms of what's available, not only at a production scale, but also at a cost, that's, I think, equal or in line with the technologies we have available today, whether that be gas, whether that be, kind of the price points where we're seeing some of the existing storage and renewable options. I think things are going to continue to open up as far as opportunities for us. That's why we're very excited about all the different emerging technologies that have been shown to us through Flex Power Bundle. But I think there's going to be a timing of what's available now versus what will be available at the end of the decade and what will be available for us, even beyond that. So hopefully that, at least
Thank you, Kevin.
that's my view, certainly.
Appreciate that. That's all I've got, Reed.
Let me just one more time. Peter's question's right on point, but it really is going to relate to after the second presentation, because right now we're just kind of catching up. Then we're going to look at the building blocks and we're going to see where we need to be. And the time frame that we're actually going to be looking at is 2030. Okay, we've got to make progress. We're behind. We got to make something happen in the next 7 years, 6, 7 years, 8 years. But so that time frame is the time frame we're going to be looking at, and we don't want to preclude out there in the future. But I'm telling you, even looking out 5 to 7 years is pretty tough, because I think we're going to have some great breakthroughs, and we don't want to preclude ourselves by making big investments until we get to see that opportunity and hold our capital. So let's remember, we're gonna be thinking about that. So thanks for that question, Peter. All right, Andy, you're next.
Didn't have any questions.
Oh, no questions? Okay, Al, you're next.
On page 7, where I'm looking at 2029, 2030, is this when we need to make decisions, or we need to make decisions prior to that before we get to the -1% on?
Before, obviously. That would be a little, yes, before.
Okay. I would think so, but how many years does it take to build a plant?
Well, it depends on which plant and what you're doing. So I'll let Benny talk about that.
Thank you, Reed. So Al, when you look at renewable plants today, good rule of thumb is 3 years. Typically 4 or 5 years if we're going to move into the gas space to achieve dispatchable operation. Geothermal, we're probably looking at about 5 years as well, from what we've been able to put together talking with folks.
Okay, so being on the safe side, we need to plan, at least we need to make a decision 5 years in advance.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Then on 12, slide 12, what is, for all these different types of generation plants that we've got, what is a turn on time? You mentioned earlier that you need to make a decision a day ahead of time as to whether we're going to generate or buy. Is it because of the slow turn on of these? And
It's a great question, and I'll provide an initial answer and ask Benny to step in and correct anything. When we look, I'll kind of start from the bottom up, so to speak. So when you look at the Milton B. Lee East and West units, those units can start anywhere generally around 20, 30 minutes. So those are the ones particularly that are able to make decisions on real time, in terms of looking at what's coming in the next hour or next couple hours. When you look at the intermediate peaking category, the Summers and the Browning units, so the start time on those is dependent on kind of when they last ran. So if they're what we would call a hot unit, means it ran yesterday, the start time on those could be hours, 3 hours. If it hasn't been run, say, in a week, and it's what we call cold, there's just the boiler's cold, for example, it has to be completely heated up. Start time is 13 hours. So when you're looking at a unit like that, that's why I said generally we're preferably making a decision the day before on whether we have to start that unit to have it available for the next day.
is it common to have a generating plant down for a week?
Yes, certainly. Particularly when you look at what we call the shoulder months. So fall and spring, generally loads are very low. When we're talking 70-degree temperatures, our load is very moderate here in San Antonio. So we don't need to run all of our power plants to meet that need. So yes, it's common that in those types parts of the year, those peaking units, Summers and Bronick, may not run for a couple weeks, several weeks at a time. When you look at summer, right now, for example, as temperatures are starting to heat up, generally those peaking units will generally be running most days. So for example, with the cooler weather that came in the other day and the rain, it allowed us to take a couple units offline. As temperatures are heating back up for the weekend, we expect that those units will be back online to meet our needs. I did want to, if I could, just jump back real quick. I'm glad you asked the question, Al, on the reserve margin, because I realized I probably didn't really explain the slide very well. But as you look at that minus 1%, that is what we're showing here is the effect if we shut down Summers 1, Summers 2, Spruce 1, and don't add anything. So it kind of is meant to also emphasize the need, why we're going through this generation planning exercise this summer, why we were committed to put options and decision points in front of the board by December, so that the board can make some decisions, give us guidance on where we need to go, so we have ample time to add the generation so we don't ever get to that minus 1%. We want to stay, again, minimum above 13.75. So I don't expect the long-term view to look like this. I showed it this way, again, to emphasize the fact that we're prepared to make decisions on some of our generating units, which means we have to make decisions on what to replace them with.
Thank you.
There's one more kind that we really didn't talk about. It's a hybrid. So the combined cycle plant, the turbine parts of that can start up real fast, but you're not going to bring the steam part up for a while. So they start up different at different capacities. So, okay, anything else, Al?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
All right, Michael Kinnick?
Yeah, just a quick question on the ancillary services. I understand that we either buy them or sell them to ERCOT based on economic factors, but just in a typical year, what percentage of the time do you think we're buying ancillary services as compared to selling ancillary services to ERCOT?
I don't have a specific.
Hang on here. Let's be real careful. Correct me, somebody out here, but my experience has been you can supply your own required ancillary services. So in that case, you're avoiding buying and you're not receiving anything for it. You can sell if you have extra ancillary, or you can buy if you're short. I think those are the three. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's the three buckets you're going to fall in.
Yeah. So as you said, Reed, we have the ability to self-serve and provide our own ancillary services. Where we would typically need to buy, if you will, from ERCOT will be generally during fall and spring when we have multiple units on outages. So we at that point may be using the available generation we have just to meet our energy needs. Generally throughout the year, because we have designed our portfolio to have reserve margin, we're generally what I call in a long position, which means we have more generation available than the load that we need to serve on a given day. And so to Reed's point, in that case, we're in a position to sell some of our capacity to ERCOT for ancillary services. We can meet our own needs and then sell a little extra to ERCOT.
And these are confusing, even for the people in the business, I'm telling you sometimes. So I clipped a little bit more detailed thing. I'll send it to Ann and she'll send it out to us. It's a little bit more detailed explanation of them. Okay, anything else, Michael? Anne Marie?
She didn't have any.
Okay, Jack? Let's see the folks. Jack?
Yeah, sorry. I don't have any questions.
Okay. Wayne?
Just a quick one on the 5 years. I know we're talking to 2030, but that doesn't mean we can spend 3 years deliberating. I imagine there's going to be some design time in there and some other things before you actually get to start the 5 years. So we don't want to wait till, 2025. And so we got this much time to deliberate. We want to make sure that we get something done so that they can get out and get the designs done, because it's going to be too expensive for them to try to design all of the possibilities only for us to pick two or whatever the situation is. So let's not wait 3 to 4 years to make a decision if all possible. If I'm wrong about your 5 years, you can tell me that includes your design or not. Thank you.
I think anybody in the room here totally agrees with that. And we'll talk a little bit more of the timeline in the next presentation. And then I know we've already heard from Rudy that his timeline, at least to get a lot of this work done, is by the end of the year. So hopefully everybody will get their directions from the board and I guess whatever you have to get from the council by the end of the year, if anything. Wayne, anything else? Michael Sanchez.
No questions. Thanks for the presentation, Kevin. Thanks.
Dee Dee.
Actually, I'm gonna hold up on my question until the next presentation. Thanks.
Sure. Christopher Fulton.
Thank you for the presentation and the wealth of data and historical trends. That's really educational and helpful. And along those lines, I was curious, when we think of, I think it was page 7, slide 7, my colleagues have been talking about the ramping up time for planning on new units. And we have, clearly some experience in the last 10 or 15 years of new units going online in different kinds of generation capacities. What have been the takeaways, the lessons learned from the projected startup time and functioning to the actual performance? Were there some bugs in the system or other learning glitches that took a year or two to sort out in order to get them up to current operating capacity?
We'll let the operating guy answer that one.
Thank you. So when you work through a plant design process, there's a process in which the engineering companies employ lessons learned so they can build on the shoulders of those that came before. I'll tell you that when you commission a plant, you normally set aside a period of time measured in weeks, and you go online and you get the plant up and running, and there will be what many term infant mortality issues, and those will linger for perhaps a year or two. And things will occur, but you'll manage those just in the routine course of business. You experience that with all types of plants, be it the large thermal facilities or even solar facilities. So yeah, you get a good team in place though, and you manage them as part of your routine maintenance program. You become really good firefighters until you work through that process.
Thank you. And another question in terms of our data, that go back to some of the earlier questions that we heard from the councilwoman and from Anaquit Garcia. I know externalities can be notoriously finicky and difficult to put numbers on. And some of those are tracked by other city agencies. But when I look at for instance, in the appendix, it's an energy utilization chart, but it's a very helpful chart in terms of breaking down by month and by generation facility certain kinds of data. Do we yet have any data that could be broken down into this kind of format in terms of different kinds of emissions that are being given off, whether we're talking about CO2, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, or for that matter, particulate matter questions that are contributing to our air quality problems here locally and maybe asthma and other health problems?
So we do. Each of our thermal units are equipped with a continuous emissions monitoring system, and it's managed by our environmental team. And reporting, there's an audit process, a validation process, and the reporting goes to EPA for review. So yes, sir, all that information is collected and reported, and then we have annual roll-ups.
Would that be available online, or otherwise could we make it available? For instance, especially when we think about generation categories, intermediate, peaking, and so forth, it might be instructive for us to know to what degree our emissions spike when we switch over to a new generating unit, like for peaking purposes.
So the EPA has that information available on their websites. They consolidate and report it out.
It also varies by type of unit, Christopher. So if we've got a unit that's got a selective catalytic recovery on it, it's going to be different than one that doesn't. So each unit's going to have a profile. It's going to have a environmental pollutant profile. In our planning, it would probably be a good thing that we put those profiles in so that as we run harder or less on a unit, or we take one out and add one in, that's kind of what John and his folks did on our first little model. It was a shorthand, and it focused on CO2, because CO2, while we've got other pollutants, the CO2 is the big indicator, and they all, except the renewables, all make CO2. So we use CO2 as a proxy for shifting in and out of units and either reducing or increasing pollutants. And so I'm sure that when we get to the building blocks in the next section, or when we start talking about what we want to see, that was obviously something, as Peter mentioned in our earlier work, and Dee Dee, that's something we're going to want to see. No. Okay, another question, Christopher?
That does it here. Thank you.
Okay. Femi, you on? Let me see the
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Go.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to quickly, I'm on the road, so I actually parked so I could reduce the distraction and noise from the road. But I'm going to echo Peter Onofre's comments. Again, thank you, Kevin, for giving some focus to ancillary services. This was something that we had a lot of questions when we reviewed the 4-year generation planning model. So thanks for giving this more focus this time around. My question is still on ancillary services, and I'm going to reserve a couple of other questions for much later in the next presentation. But you talked about the fact that it's cheaper sometimes to buy from ERCOT than to run our own plants to support ancillary services, i.e. better to, as I said, is pay our 7% share than to use our own plants to provide those ancillary services. Is that correct, the way I have expressed it? Is that exactly what you're trying to say?
Yes, I think for both energy and ancillary services, there will be periods of time where the market price for either energy or ancillary services or both will be beneficial for us, more beneficial for us and our customers to buy that either energy or ancillary services from ERCOT as opposed to self-producing it, self-providing it.
Right, and that usually is perhaps a day ahead or real-time decision as opposed to a long-range planning decision. Because you can't tell when those prices would be favorable or not when you're doing a 5, 10, 15, or even 25-year planning exercise.
I think that's a great observation. We look at those decisions on when it's economical, if you will, to buy from ERCOT versus produce. As you said, those are day ahead, real-time decisions. From a capacity planning perspective or a generation planning perspective, when you look at the long term, as you said, over 10, 15, 25 years, what we're trying to do or what we're planning for is to have enough capacity to meet both our energy and our ancillary service obligations. So essentially, we know kind of what the maximum cost our customers will pay. And then as you get into the day ahead real time, we'll make those optimization decisions based on, again, tomorrow's market. But as you said, you don't know what the long term will show. So our goal is to ensure we have capacity essentially to protect ourselves from wherever market prices may move.
Yeah, and the reason I ask this is because it would seem as if, and again, in the very extreme and I'll say wasteful case, we could just be holding on to capacity just in case we need it, because we can't tell that future 10, 15, or 20 years ahead. Now, if that is on that premise, and again, you could argue that my premise of considering it a waste, just hold resources and capacity in case you need it, you can question that, but just assume that premise for a second and say, my question is, what capacity, or at least do you have any data or any information or whatever that indicates what percentage of that capacity being held for ancillary services is actually requested for and deployed, to support ERCOT? Do you have that type of information?
We should be able to pull that together as far as how much of the ancillary services that, where we have reserved that capacity versus how the amount of times that ERCOT has called upon that capacity to be utilized. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't have it available, obviously, as I'm standing here today, but we can pull that information together.
Femi,
I think
Femi, this
yes,
is
sorry,
Ray.
go ahead.
Just to your point there, when we actually do the modeling and we look at scenarios, one of the variable that we'll be looking at, and I'm sure everyone does, is if you have a certain scenario, what is that? What's the variable? One of the variables is reserve, how much you got, and if you want to think about it that way, you might say, well, then I need to have at least 5% more or some percent more, just to be sure I've taken care of ancillary services. So that's something that we're going to have to look at on a sensitivity basis, I think, and get somebody
think so.
comfortable at some level, because as you said, we're not going to know 25 years out, but we might
I know.
have some level of comfort at some level and not comfort at another level.
I agree, and that's probably something that can be informed by historical, just from at least, if we don't know the future, at least we can look at the past and get a sense of, what that could be. But that will be part of the decision process to say, have we even performed well with reservation of capacity for ancillary services, and maybe we need to do more or less based on that past experience. So again, modeling could also be beneficial if we look back as we plan for the future. I asked all these questions also because I want to touch on something Kevin mentioned during our review of the model, and this will be my last question. You used the word, we do not intend to run our plants continuously to support base load or things like that. And then the next thing you also said was, I guess, let me rephrase. You used the term, we do not intend to run our plants continuously, i.e. in terms of supporting base, intermediate, or peaking load. But I want to ask, those plants that are not run continuously, do you have any indication that some of those plants can actually run a little more? I.e., if it were a peaking plant, can it actually be extended to support intermediate load? Hello? Hello?
Oh, stand by.
Am I still there?
So a couple things I would say. I think the different types of generators, we have different intended uses for, right? Base load we do expect to run 24/7 around the clock. And I apologize if I wasn't clear earlier, but like our peaking units, for example, we don't intend for them to run for an extended duration. Largely we intend for them to run, as I said, highest peak hours of the day, highest low days of the year. They are capable of more extended operation. For example, our Milton B. Lee units during Winter Storm Uri, they ran for basically 10 days around the clock at full load. So they are capable of running for a more extended period of time than we may typically use them. So like I said, in those more extreme events, the usage will change. I did want to also mention, kind of back to the discussion on ancillary services and kind of how we use ancillary services and energy. As the ERCOT market is continuing to evolve, it's evolving rapidly. When you look at some of the changes that ERCOT has made, both from their operating posture, their operating strategies following Winter Storm Uri. We're seeing, the Public Utility Commission is having discussions on changes in market design. So all of that has the potential to change, again, what that ancillary service makeup looks like, what our needs are. And so that's another reason why we look from a fuel type perspective and also the types of generators, why we think that diversity is a very important part of our strategy. So as the market evolves, if we're kind of over leveraged in base load generation or over leveraged in peaking units or different fuel types, as the market design changes, the market rules change, that's another risk that we have to manage. So that's another thing that we continue to monitor every day as far as how is the market evolving. It's not just market rules. Have seen tremendous growth over the last 10 years throughout ERCOT, both with wind generation. I think I don't have the exact number, but we're close to or just above 30,000 megawatts of installed generation on wind. Solar has seen a similar rapid ramp up. Battery technology or battery installations is kind of the next one that's showing very strong development or projections in terms of growth in ERCOT. So all of those changes are coming together at this point in time, really, as we're looking to transition our fleet as well. So that evolution of the market is a very important factor for us to look at as well.
Femi, as you remember on our first little look, we used the day ahead price to tie ourselves into the market and make sure we weren't making a decision that was not rational or reasonable or even possible within the marketplace. So as we get into the planning next section of this, we've got to make assumptions about where the ERCOT system is going. If we don't, we can't do it in a microcosm. So you're exactly right. We'll have to have those outside. We got to put the whole game plan in here around what we're doing.
Yeah, and just a comment, we could respond to it later on. I also agree with you that some form of sensitivity analysis will be necessary, just so that we can look at how all these combinations of factors can play into the decisions that will be before the board and the management and even the city council. And so I think just to that point, the modeling, whatever that would be, is something that I don't know whether we would then be able to. We would need to have access to some of the more detailed and sophisticated modeling capabilities that CPS Energy has, or what. I don't know yet, but we might get to that when we get to the next presentation. But I just wanted to leave that comment.
Yeah, no, they'll be doing it. So in that respect, we have access to it. Okay, Anita, you're next and last.
All right, thank you. And thank you so much for the presentation, Kevin. And I also really appreciated a lot of the questions and comments today. As I was looking at the presentation, I keep going back to kind of our first technical committee. I wanted to talk about and ask you, Kevin, about the, weather data in a forecast model. Just thinking about it very simply, I think about, obviously one of the other sides of planning generation is and projecting future demand, aside from the things that we, have talked about, is also like the projected weather data. And I think, if I remember correctly, I want you to correct me, I think that you talked about, that we've been using kind of like 15-year kind of a backcast, like what's happened with the weather over the past 15 years. And so, I know that, this is a rapidly changing, the atmospheric sciences or in the whole, weather forecasting, it's being heavily studied and developed right now. So I just wanted to kind of ask that question because it seems that there will continue to be a higher degree of error because we're going to have, more extreme heat or longer periods of heat. Obviously, all of those things will also affect the ancillary services pricing because it's not just based on availability, it's based on weather as well as we saw in Winter Storm Uri. So can you talk a little bit about that, because I feel very passionate about us, starting to go down the road of changing how, instead of using the historic cast, to look at basically developing a method of forecasting a future cast.
Sure, I would, if we can go back to the presentation, I'd ask everybody to look at slides 5 and 6. But as you said, generally our process historically, when we look at load forecasting into the future, has been to use average weather. And so we look at that over, I think I said 30 years earlier, I'll have to confirm, it's either 30 or 15. But that's what we call our average weather, and we plug that temperature, so to speak, into our models, and that's where our average peak demand forecast comes out. The reason I asked everybody to go back to slides 5 and 6 is because we are showing on those slides, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, what we're calling our stress peak. But we are looking at not only what we expect from that average weather pattern, but we're looking more now at what happens if we see more extreme weather. Part of that I think is looking at kind of where weather is going recently in terms of climatological patterns, looking at what we saw during Winter Storm Uri, for example. And so I do think as we look at capacity planning for the future, it is important for us to look not only what we expect to happen, kind of based on long-term averages, but if that's all that we look at, we run the risk of not having capacity available to protect our community when we see a more extreme winter or summer. So that how we factor in those more extreme weather temperatures is an important consideration for us that we're working on how we integrate that into our normal planning process, so to speak, for future load projections.
Awesome, and thank you, Kevin. And I definitely will, want to learn more about that from you as we move forward. And I know that, like, the National Atmospheric Sciences, Foundation, like, I think I may have messed up that name, but that center, they've been developing like the ensemble system, and it like updates every 6 hours, but it's really like, and it runs out to like 60 hours ahead, like a future cast. And so there has been some like discussion about overlaying that on top of historic data to decrease the probability of error. And so I don't know if you have any comments on that, but thank you so much. And I'm really interested in this, and I think it's a very important piece of our future.
Well, the only comment I would add there, again, I think as you look at long-term generation planning, 10, 25 years, looking at average weather patterns has kind of been, I think, the industry norm, if you will. Certainly as we look at, and we've spent a lot of time today also talking about our day ahead and real-time activities, as we're looking at what we expect to happen today, tomorrow, and into next week, we look at a variety of forecasts. So we're looking at things, we have a weather service we use. We look at National Weather Service. As we get into summer, we look every day at what the National Hurricane Center is saying for storms. So we bring in every kind of bit of weather forecasting that we can. We have a meteorologist that will be on staff here starting in a couple weeks. So we'll have, again, additional in-house expertise. So when we look at weather planning, we incorporate as many sources of data as we can.
Anita, that's really important, and I think that's where the sensitivity analysis has got to come in, because we got to find a zone, a range where we're reasonably comfortable, and there are huge changes coming. So I appreciate that comment. What's next, Anita?
That's it for now.
All right, you're taking us to break for 5 minutes, and then we'll be starting in the second presentation. Thank you, Anita. Let's see. I see him coming. Okay. Now, just to recap where we're going, what Kevin is going to do, and Benny, if he has anything to add, is we're going to talk about the building blocks, okay, that we're going to work with to come up, because I'm going to go around to everyone and ask them where they think we could, should, or might be at 2030, okay? So we're talking 7 or 8 years, 6.5 years. We're not talking 2050, 2070, 2080. And we're not, because frankly, if we're going to solve this environmental problem and this heat problem, we got to have some more technologies, and they're coming. I'm convinced there's enough push now that we'll get some new technologies. As soon as they get commercialized, we need to be in a position to adopt them, all right? We can't adopt them if we've made decisions that preclude us from adopting them or use up all of our capital, all right? So we've got to think about how we go through this interim period, improve our emissions, reduce our cost, increase our reliability, and get in a position to make good decisions when new technologies come on. So think about that as Kevin's making his presentation, and then we'll go around the group again.
Yeah, thanks. And I can't emphasize what Reed said enough. Kevin's got a good presentation here. He's going to lay out a lot of good information, but then we truly need your insights on these models we're going to develop. We know you want to look at things like Spruce 2 out of the mix completely. So we want to get all that written down and get a plan in place so we can start working through modeling. So please, please, please ask your questions, whatever you need. And also, we had passed out a book a while back on generation technologies. If anybody needs another copy of that book, please let us know, okay? Kevin?
Thank you, Benny. So as we go through this presentation, I think the first part of it is intended to set some context. So some of this I think will be a review of some material that we covered either in September. We did, I think, a pretty extensive generation planning kind of introduction in September. We talked again, I think, in January on some topics. So some of these slides may look familiar, and I apologize for any of that redundancy, but I did think it was important to set some context as part of this presentation for the discussion points we'll have towards the end of the presentation. So we're going to talk a bit about some of the drivers, that we're looking at as far as our need for generation. We started in the last presentation to talk about diversification. We'll have a little bit more on that topic. And then we'll go through some updates on where we're headed, or where we think we're headed over the next few months here this summer. And as Benny said, why we want to have this discussion today is to ensure that you all understand kind of what we're thinking, as well as seeking feedback on other things that we collectively think will be important to look at. I did want to start again, just starting with population growth. We spent a lot of time talking about making decisions around Braunegg, Summers, Spruce. But the other reality is that we're a growing community. We're expecting over 1 million people to move into the San Antonio metropolitan area over the next 20 years or so. With that comes load growth. You can see the box we have there on the chart, but we're forecasting, about up to 95 megawatts of annual growth in our peak load demand. So that's why when I showed you the chart in the last presentation for 2025 and said our peak load forecast then is over 5,400 megawatts. Again, that's about 300 megawatts higher than our current all-time record. But that's driven, that change in forecast, or change in load is driven by this factor that we have the luxury, if you will, of having the problem of having to plan for a growing community. I did want to touch again on fuel diversification. This chart just is a quick view of our history of generation over the last 50 years. But one of the hallmarks of our generation strategy in recent years has been diversification. So I'll go through this quickly, but again, you can see in 1970, basically we were 100% natural gas generation fleet. As we saw challenges in the 1970s that challenged our customer bills, we made a decision to expand into other technologies. So we started, with the yellow slice of the pie there. We added coal, the DELA units there in the 1980s. We made decisions to further diversify with the addition of nuclear in terms of the blue slice. As we got into the early 2000s, we diversified with gas, but different types of gas. We added our peaking units. We added the combined cycle unit with AVR. So a newer, more efficient, more flexible gas generation than the Braunig and Summers units. But we also started our journey into renewables. We started with wind, quickly grew into being the largest wind off-taker here in Texas. And then we added solar. So we now have about 950, right about, megawatts of wind under contract. And then as of Tuesday, we now have about 850 megawatts of solar under contract. So 550 actively producing, and then the 300 megawatt contract we announced with Con Ed, which we expect to come online early 2025. So again, as we talked last time about, our last presentation about diversification of types of generators between baseload, peaking, it's just as important in our mind over history to have diversified with fuel types. This slide, just kind of slide through 5, I'm sorry for those again who are following along on just your handouts. Slide 5, I've tried to list some of the benefits of diversification. By having the diversified fuel types, it does provide us some protection against being from any change in commodity pricing. For example, natural gas prices have seen a tremendous under tremendous pressure here in the last few months with things, supply challenges, if you will, given what's going on in Europe. So we do have other types of generation between our renewable fleet, our coal fleet, our nuclear fleet, that aren't susceptible to those types of moves in prices. At times, we've seen challenges in other fuel commodities, either pricing or delivery. So that's one of the reasons we look at the benefits of that fuel diversification. By having the multiple fuel sources, it's helped us from an emission standpoint. I'll show some information on that on the next slide. It also has helped us, maintain, very competitive rates. We continue to be among the lowest electricity rates for large cities here in Texas and even in the top 10, top 20 cities in the United States. We talked a little bit in the last presentation about the evolution of the ERCOT market and how it's changing. So again, this diversification in fuel mix, I think, is important. Again, as the rules change or as just the mix within ERCOT changes, by not being over leveraged, if you will, on any one fuel type, again, whether that's coal, nuclear, gas, or renewables, it helps protect us from changes in the market design, changes in the rules, or just changes in the overall ERCOT mix that's driving changes in pricing, for example. This slide really shows a history over the last 40 years, if you will, of what we call our carbon intensity. So that carbon intensity essentially is the tons of carbon per megawatt hour of energy that we produce. And so there's 2 lines here. I'll direct your attention first to the dark blue line. And so as you're looking from left to right, that line increases. That's the amount of generation per year that we produce to meet our community's obligations. The lighter blue line that decreases from left to right is our carbon intensity. So over the last 40 years, even though the amount of energy that we need to produce to meet our community's needs has grown significantly, the benefits of that fuel diversification has helped to reduce that overall carbon intensity pretty dramatically. This, again, chart is focused on carbon, but we've seen similar reduction trends when you look at nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, other emissions. We've been very aggressive, I think, over the last 40 years or so in driving down our emissions profile. Again, this is our starting point. I think we've shown this slide before, but this is our fleet as of today. We've circled in gold, the Spruce plants, the Summers plants, the Braunig plants. Those are, again, the generation units that we expect we're going to make decisions on as Reed said, over the next 8 years, really by the end of the decade. I think we've talked a little bit about the longer term, to get to the 2050 goals in terms of the climate action and adaptation plan. Really, honestly, realistically, every unit that we show on this slide, on this pie chart, we're gonna have decisions made on every one of those units. So over time, what my point there is, we have an initial transition period. What do we need to do immediately to get through the next 8 years? As we stabilize kind of the fleet, as we transition Braunig, Summers, and the Spruce units, then we get to go right back into the next planning stage for what do we do with the rest of the fleet, again, to get us to 2050. On slide 8, this is just a chart that shows really the age of our generating units. And so the importance here, a couple things. Again, we've circled it in blue, the Summers, the Braunig, the Spruce units. Again, those are the units that we are looking at making decisions on. That represents about 3,000 megawatts of generation capacity. When you look at age of units, that's one factor that we can't hide from, if you will. The Braunig units are all over 50 years old. Summers 1, Summers 2, quickly approaching that threshold. And then again, as you see, as we get to the end of the decade and look at kind of what we do past this transition period, the rest of our units are going to continue to age as well. On slide 9, I just wanted to show we kind of have two parallel paths underway. We talked earlier in the last presentation and some really insightful comments about the urgency that we have in front of us. So what I'm showing here is kind of two parallel paths on how we're going to address these generation changes. The first one being the Braunig units. The plan to replace the Braunig units is our Flex Power Bundle. That's in progress. That's in flight. We started that project, if you will, about 2 years ago or so. And we expect, as I said, the first contract, 300 megawatts of solar with Con Ed was the first contract to be finished or announced with that bundle. But we're looking to finish the rest of the 900 megawatts of solar, our energy storage, our 500 megawatts of firming capacity. We're looking to wrap up those contracts, ideally within the next couple months. But we expect that generation to be online, within the next, 2 to 3 years. When you look at the Summers 1 and 2 and the Spruce units, kind of that second parallel path, that's this whole generation planning activity that we're talking about today, right? That we've been talking about at the last couple meetings, and the plan that we've said, the set of options and the recommendation that Rudy is committed to putting in front of the board by December. That's really what the plan is around Summers and Spruce. And from that capacity perspective, we look at that capacity will be coming online, kind of starting in the middle of the decade, 2025-ish, through roughly 2028. But as we pointed out in the last conversation, to get to that point, it's important for us to make progress and make decisions very soon. On slide 10, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. We've covered this timeline slide in our last meeting, but again, we're here in May talking about the scenarios, the options that we are looking to model. We'll be working on the modeling, as we get into the summer. We'll come back towards the end of summer, early fall, to be able to talk about our preliminary results. And all that will lead into the recommendation, the conversation that we'll make to the board. And we obviously expect that the RAC will provide their input to the board as well. On slide 11, so the next couple slides, what we try to do here is summarize all the notes and insights that we got from our flip chart exercise, if you'll remember from the February meeting. We spent our February meeting kind of going around the room and everybody talked about some of their thoughts and interests and concerns with generation planning. So this is really a summary of the notes that were captured from that exercise. And the point here, I think, is that insight was very valuable to us as we looked at kicking off and planning and executing the generation planning activities. And so I don't plan to work and read through each and every one of these bullets. But just for example, we spent some time in February talking about the effects of energy efficiency. And so, that's one of the things, for example, that we're looking at as we look at running the modeling throughout the summers. What is the impact on our generation needs, so to speak, if we assume an energy efficiency program versus if we don't? One of the other potentials for us to look at is what does it look like if we have an aggressive energy efficiency program, perhaps beyond what the board approved at the last meeting here recently. Again, maybe not for the next 5 years, but as we get to the end of the decade and as we bring on this additional capacity, what might a more aggressive energy efficiency plan do in terms of cost versus cost to invest in generation? So those are the types of insights I think that you all provided, the committee provided to us in February, that we're incorporating into our modeling and into our planning. And it's the same type of insights as Benny was mentioning that we hope to get from you today, so we can continue to refine our approach here for the summer. Slide 2 or slide 12, again, kind of page 2 of this. These were some of the comments and questions about specifically around some of the modeling concerns and interests, and we'll talk more about that here on the next few slides. So slide 13 is meant to, again, talk about the fact that we are a utility in transition in terms of our generation fleet. We need to make some steps immediately to get us through the next 8 years. So what this slide shows is kind of a preliminary, or some of our preliminary thoughts on the timeline and the sequence of how that might happen. So I'm going to jump kind of to the orange bars, if you will, that are shown in that blue shaded area. That's the addition of the flex power bundle capacity. So we're looking from the firming capacity, we're looking at pursuing natural gas, as we talked about before. We're looking at likely a 5-year arrangement with the potential to extend that for another 5 years to give us, access, if you will, to that a natural gas resource to use as a bridge as we get to some of the other emerging technologies that we think are very promising. Again, part of the rest of that flex power bundle is our storage and solar components. We think those will come online mid-2024 to early 2025. And that's kind of the first step. Adding that capacity then allows us to take the next step, which will be to retire the Browning units. As you look at kind of a likely sequence of events, and again, I say this is likely, none of this is set in stone as far as being approved by the board. We certainly are looking for your input on these scenarios, but a likely next step then is going to be, again, partly due to the age of the unit, will be to retire Summers 1. We're looking at, as far as decisions, if we make decisions around the Spruce units, one option that we're looking at and the board has been talking about is doing a conversion to gas on Spruce 2. We think that would need to happen before we would retire Spruce 1, so that, again, we know we have some certainty of capacity with Spruce 2 before we take the step of retiring Spruce 1, and then kind of similar time frame, kind of the end of that 2028, 2029 period, potentially then would be the Summers 2 retirement. Again, those are preliminary dates, but all these is in that initial transition period are the first steps, or the next steps, I'll say, in our journey towards achieving our goals under the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan by 2050. We also know there's interim goals for 2030 and 2040 that we're keeping track of, again, as we make steps in how we transition our fleet, that all that becomes very important. Moving to slide 14, what I wanted to show, and it's a slightly different view than the reserve margin chart that I showed in the last presentation, but I think the message is very similar. So just the way the slide is set up, if you look at the stack bar, the dark blue is our existing generation capacity. So you see, as you look from 2022 to 2025, that dark blue takes a step down. That's the retirement of the Browning units. It gets filled in by the orange, which is our flex power bundle, again, that combination of solar storage and firming capacity. As you see further steps down in the existing generation, that dark blue line in 2027, that would again be the initial Summers 1 retirement, and then the change to 2029 would be Spruce 1 and Summers 2. But the point there again, let me back up before I talk about the point, but the two horizontal lines, the bottom line represents our load obligations. The top line represents our 13.75% reserve margin. One thing to point out, again, tying back to the initial slide on population growth, is you see that those load lines have a very steady increase, particularly starting towards the middle of the decade and working up. That's the load growth that we need to address, as well as just transition of the existing generation. But the point of this slide, I think, again, as the reserve margin slide showed, is if all we do is execute our flex power bundle to replace the Browning units and potentially convert Spruce 2, if that's all we do, and then further retire Summers 1, Summers 2, and Spruce 1, we have a capacity gap. That would not leave enough generation capacity for us to meet our customers' needs. What that means, as you can see in the takeaway box, is we then become exposed to the market. And that's what we're trying to prevent, is being exposed to the market in terms of not being able to protect our customers if market prices, were to move up, for example. Whether that's a long-term move in prices or even pricing changes that you'll see on a daily basis. Slide 15 just kind of puts into bullets that transition slide I talked about 2 slides ago. So again, this just shows it's a proposed starting point. We know there's probably many other solutions and options here, but this just shows, again, the Browning units we're looking at retiring in March of 2025. So again, that's right after winter. Usually in the past, we've typically considered the end of the calendar year as when we would retire units. We thought it made more sense, again, given still being very close on the heels of Winter Storm Uri, to retire our capacity after winter as opposed to in the middle of it. Summers 1, again, 2027 timeframe. And then you can see Spruce 1. That is shown at the end of the calendar year because there are some environmental restrictions where we would not be able to move into calendar year 29. And then Summers 2, again, we'd look to extend past the end of winter. As far as kind of planned additions that we know are coming is the flex power bundle. Beyond that, we have needs, but that's the purpose of this generation planning exercise, is putting that recommendation in front of the board on what those additional additions will be. The other column, again, shows one possibility with Spruce 2 would be to convert it to gas. I'll talk more in a couple of slides as well, but there are some other scenarios that we think we could use with Spruce 2. Instead of converting it to gas, one solution potentially is to look at just replacing Spruce 2, retiring it completely and replacing it, for example, with renewables. There will be cost considerations, as we talked about in the last presentation, but I think it's important for us to go through and show all of that. So again, the committee has all the information available upon which to base your insights to the board. Slide 16 really shows our options. So again, that gap that I talked about is Spruce 1's retirement, Summers 1, Summers 2. So what we've looked at is kind of the 3 main options that we're planning to model this summer would be filling that gap, replacing, that's about 1,400 megawatts when you look at those 3 units. So we'd look at adding a renewable scenario. So those 1,400 megawatts would be filled in essentially with a combination of renewables, wind, solar. One potential option there also would be to include geothermal. Storage will have to be part of that. A second option that we're looking at, instead of replacing those 1,400 megawatts with renewable, it would be all natural gas, some combination, if you will, of combined cycle units. And then the more flexible, as we talked about with the last presentation, faster starting, in terms of reciprocating engines or other types of combustion turbines that essentially fill that peaking unit type of solution. And then the third, option that we're looking at is what we're calling a blended approach, but it would look a lot, if you will, like our portfolio now, where we have a combination of renewables and some level of natural gas that can together fill in that 1,400 megawatts of generation that we need to add to address Summers 1, Summers 2, and Spruce 1. As I talked about earlier, the note here does say kind of what's assumed is that Spruce 2 would be converted to gas, but I think certainly as we look at that all renewable solution, an alternative solution that we think makes sense to look at would be to show Spruce 2 there as being retired as opposed to converted to gas. So again, we're just looking at all the different types of scenarios that we think need to be looked at. Slide 17 is just kind of a summary of what we're looking at as far as the proposed modeling process. There's a number of detailed assumptions that are inputs into that model. You see some of the main ones just listed here. It talks about, again, usage. What are what our load forecast is, because that ultimately drives what our generation needs will be, what the effects are of energy efficiency, the cost, projected cost of each of the types of generations is part of that. Obviously, what we assume around fuel prices is a big driver. ERCOT market prices. I talked earlier about the evolution of the ERCOT market. What that really translates into, or one of the key things that translates into from the modeling process, is what do we assume as far as ERCOT market prices going forward? Because that has a big impact on, again, what types of generators will function well, if you will, with what we expect prices to be in ERCOT. From a modeling perspective, all these scenarios or options will be run through, our production cost model. We're looking at a 25-year horizon. Bullet 2 there talks about uncertainty analysis. So there will be different sensitivities that we run. Again, so just picking on fuel prices, for example, there's kind of a base fuel price assumption that will be incorporated, but then also what does the scenarios look like when you have a low natural gas environment and low prices? What does it look like if we have a high price environment? So that those different types of sensitivities are part of what we'll be looking at. The points of consideration when you look there, what we think are important things to look at as far as how we might ultimately make a decision around which of these options works best for our community. Affordability, reliability, resiliency, environmental responsibility. I think that will translate into looking at emissions levels, for example, between the different scenarios. Workforce impacts, in terms of our ability as a community to provide, high-paying jobs in terms of generation assets here locally. I think that's an important consideration. Certainly risk, right? That's all part of it. Part of what we're hoping as well as we work through today's meeting is what does the committee also think, or some other do you agree, for example, with those points of consideration? Are there other things that you think should be part of that scorecard, as we try to ultimately bring the different analysis together and look at the results and ultimately make a recommendation or put together a recommendation that Rudy will put in front of the board here at the end of the year. So that really kind of takes me through the end of this second presentation, and I'll turn it over to Reed to walk us through comments and questions.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Again, remember what we're focused on. While they'll run their model for 25 years, we're focused on the next 7 years, okay? And so what I really would be helpful is for people to gather their thoughts and think about where you believe we should try to be at the end of the 7 years. Now, you don't have to be perfect on this, because we're not going to be until we see a lot of the numbers. But we got to start out with a concept of what we're going to try to do in the next 7 years and where we're going to be so we can move forward. I mean, 50-year planning is nice, but it's real risky, okay? And we're not going to make it on this planet unless we get some new technology. So let's be careful that we don't put ourselves in a position where our capital is constrained, or where we have to orphan assets that we put a lot of money into, in order to take advantage of the new technologies. And I'm going to go in the same order. And what I'm trying to ask here, and then I've got a couple of comments that were sent in. I'll make those at the appropriate time. So we'll start with Dr. Cantu.
I don't have any comments right now.
Okay, John Agatha. I'm not sure he's there anymore. Okay. Let's see. Let me find my place. Okay, there. Okay. Anakwa Garcia.
Hi, yes, just a comment and reflecting on the proposed importance of future techno solutions as a way of solving the climate crisis now. I think cautioning around maybe a synonym for techno fixes is techno optimism. You know, as a child right now, if the future that was envisioned back then, we'd all be using flying cars, which we are not. So cautioning in terms of the saying that my mom always says, no dejes para mañana lo que puedes hacer hoy. Don't leave something that you can do tomorrow or in the future for something that you can do today. And so recognizing that lowering CO2 is something that has to happen today, and wondering what these techno future solutions are. You know, there are some solutions that have us mining asteroids. It's kind of like way out there. How far are we going for techno solutions? And then being cautious about how techno solutions spur more usage, because it's for me it is a situation of paradigm shift, and not something that technology that doesn't exist right now is going to solve without us knowing also what those unintended consequences of new technologies are. So I'm very interested in learning what these forthcoming technologies are going to be. Thank you.
Okay, I've got it down. I think I've got it down properly. Councilwoman Villagrán.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
So, key for me is affordability. So, I am looking forward to those numbers to look at affordability, because if this is going to be a, I don't want us to put ratepayers as a ratepayer in a situation where my rates are going up annually along with my property taxes. So affordability is key. The other is the emissions, and I think we need as much in our tool belt as we can. And I don't know if we can go back and see when we made these shifts from natural gas to coal to nuclear or geothermal, or what, to solar, where did we see the most growth and positivity happening? Because I know technology is changing. I know when we talk about the nuclear plants and things like that, when I was a child, it was a lot different than it is now. So I really want to make sure that we are looking at all the options that we have that is going to meet our goals for the climate action plan, but also make sure that this is affordable for the residents of San Antonio. And the other thing I want to stress is we can't look at this in a silo, and that we understand that San Antonio is a growing city, and San Antonio is seeing a lot more, our wages are not being kept up with our housing prices. And is that going to be a situation with our utilities too? Because if that's the case, people are going to start moving out of town into counties that have other electrical companies that service them. So those are just my comments and thoughts. Thank you for the presentation. I look forward to more data. Thank you.
Okay, Councilman, let me just kind of read these back, make sure I got them down. Affordability, the effect of various emission changes with additional technology, past and future, comply with the climate action plan, and not plan in a silo. Hopefully I got those. Peter.
Got them, Reed. Thank you.
Okay. Peter?
Yes, thank you, Reed. And again, thank you, Kevin. As far as building blocks here in the short term for our generation planning, I support natural gas as a transition fuel. And so in that also support the converting of spruce to gas. And I would caution against overcommitting to solar and wind. as we look toward the innovation opportunities that we have, that I think there's a number of them. I know geothermal's been mentioned. I think even nuclear is going to be something that can be considered here in the short term. There's some innovative things that are happening there. And of course, we've got the battery storage component. So as we've said, we don't want to overcommit and invest in something that will keep us from being able to make a better investment here within the next 7 to 10 years. But I do want to kind of tie it together with being holistic, or how it's all symbiotic with rate design and the generation planning with STEP. And thank you, Kevin, for factoring that in. I know in our model, STEP and the energy efficiency demand savings or capacity savings weren't factored into that model. But I can see that you're going to factor that in to be able to see how the investment that we're making now as we're going into a new program, the benefits to that capacity savings. I think that's going to be critical. And my question revolving around that, because I really think that we've just got through a lot of insight into the program and the value, and now that we have it in place, I understand 10% was what was being, the capacity saving was 10% of the demand, the previous plan. And with this plan here, I know you're going to model it out, but right now, just from your projections, do you foresee it being more than that going into this next 7 years with the model that we have in place for STEP? And to tie in demand response, now I'm kind of tying in another, what percentage of that 10, if it was 10, would be demand response? If demand response management is a critical component to bringing the most expensive costs down in the demand capacity savings, how much of that will we benefit from in this new program? And I know you may not have the answers right now, but that's what I'd like to see, is the benefits that we're going to see from that. And I heard it said at the very beginning of STEP, and here recently someone said it's a fifth fuel. Some people don't quite believe that that's a true statement, or if it's an anomaly. Can you speak to that, whether you would call it a fifth fuel in relation to generation planning, the energy efficiency, the new program?
So I think a couple things. I know we have traditionally talked about energy efficiency as a fifth fuel. I think as conversation came up a little bit in the board meeting the other day, and I like how Shannon Ramirez described it, right? But I think one of the reasons why we've looked at and categorized energy efficiency the way we have is because it's helping us avoid fuel cost, if you will, right? As we're saving energy through energy efficiency, we're not having to spend the fuel on coal, nuclear, gas, renewable, whatever it may be that would fill in if we had to generate that power. I think as we look at kind of how we look at modeling going forward, I think we're looking at the board approved, a 5-year program for energy efficiency. So I think when you look at that 5 years, it kind of fits in nicely in a way with the timeline I showed earlier in terms of where we start to see the gap show up in terms of Summers 1, Summers 2, Spruce 1 is going to be in that 2027 to 2029 timeframe. So I think one of the approaches we would look at as what would kind of for the next, after those 5 years, what would the next kind of round of energy efficiency look like, and how, I think that's where we look at potentially even what a more aggressive program would look like in terms of the cost of that program versus the cost of having to build capacity or even just, the fuel cost, if you will, that would be, that would not be offset, from an energy efficiency program. So I think the next 5 years will look kind of like the program the board approved, but I think what we'll be looking at is what the future of that looks like.
Thank you, Kevin. And I would just say on rate design, I would support time of use to maximize that benefit. That's all I have, Reed. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Also, on that fuel discussion, I've been involved in that for about 13 years. And really, just to say it's a fifth fuel is shortcutting it, because really you're spending some money, and if you save, as they indicated, 90 cents or $1.90 for every dollar you put in, it is saving not only fuel, but it's saving labor, it's saving capital investment. So it's just as long as your investment has a return, you're investing in and they're charging it in the fuel pass through. But if it comes back in your energy charge, then it's dollars well spent because you're getting an immediate return of a lot of things. Okay, Andy, you're next.
Well,
Andy,
thank
where'd
you.
he go? Yeah, there you are. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Mine would be renewables, battery storage, and then, slowly trying to reduce our gas usage. The other ideas would be to see how other countries have transitioned from coal to gas to renewables. Those are some of the thoughts I've had about that. One, just throwing out there, is there any thoughts or is there any information about coastal wave and current energy generation? Since we have a large amount of coastline in Texas, I don't know if that's even feasible, or I know other countries have been looking into stuff like that, but I'm not too sure how feasible that is for us now, but maybe sometime in the future, that could be an option as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me back up and make sure I got all the Peters in. Natural gas is a transition. Convert Spruce 2 to gas. Do not overcommit to solar, precluding future options. Integrate to step and demand response. For Andy, I got renewables, battery, storage, reduce gas use, and wave technology. One thing they are working on, if you're talking about the ocean, they are looking at putting turbines out in the water, which is a very constant wind, even better than coastal wind, on coast wind. All right, we got that. Al, you're next.
Thank you. As far as energy efficiency goes, can we just go ahead and remove wind and solar? According to the the earlier presentation, summer solar is 50% at peak load, and winter solar is 0.9% at peak load. Summer wind is 20% for the west wind summer, and for the winter, west wind is 19%. And then again, the coastal wind, summer is 57 and winter is 43%. So those don't seem too efficient at that point. Also in forecasting, on slide 17, we talked about, and throughout, we talked about energy efficiency. I think energy efficiency is all encompassing cost and reliability being on the forefront there. So on forecasting, will you use the past 25 years to forecast, taking the current technology, the newer technology, and applying it for 25 years back and forward, or just going 25 years forward?
I think you were talking about the weather, weren't you? You weren't talking about technologies.
Yeah, just to clarify, when you talk the 25 years, is that the bullet we had on the modeling slide?
On the modeling, yes.
I think that's weather.
Well, for 25 years, what we would look at is a forward view of what the cost will be over the next 25 years. So we look at it's a going forward. So we take what we project our load needs to be for 25 years, the different operational characteristics. So in the case of wind and solar, I guess the profile that we would be using is based on historical, how wind and solar have historically produced, throughout the day. And that's different, again, when you're looking at coastal west wind. So we'll take that amount of history and use that profile, and assume that it's very, the same profile applies for the next 25 years. So it is a forward-looking view as far as how we're trying to produce our cost. It's not
on newer technologies that we may or may not use. When you forecast those newer technologies, could you at least do go 5 years back if we had, because we already know what the usage and weather was already, you know, from today back. Can you apply those newer technologies? If those newer technologies were in place for the last 5 years, this is where we would be now.
Well, that's kind of what we did on the first step, Al.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I think going forward, we'll have to use sensitivity and push these new down. Remember, we're talking 7 or 8 years here, so we're not talking real radical technologies, okay? What we're saying is don't preclude ourselves from adopting new technologies. As Anakwa said, we don't know the fallout from some of these technologies. I'll give you an example is ethanol. Everybody thought that was a great environmental deal, and it's a terrible environmental deal. So we got, you know, people are very up on batteries, but if we find out that these batteries are causing us other problems, then we got to think about that. But right now, we're trying to focus on the next 7 years, okay? So really, what we kind of have right now, we're going to have to shuffle around for the next 7 years. I mean, there might be small things that we can see. I know Benny's looking at a geothermal opportunity. I know that we're everybody, tons of people are looking at ammonia, okay, and moving that instead of it's a lot easier to move than moving hydrogen, and it can be used in a similar way. So there's some things that aren't real radical that we might look at towards the end of this, but there won't be anything that'll be so wild. And again, because we've already looked at the past, I think we can pretty well have to follow the similar trends. So you're not going to see a big move from that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then if I had to make a choice today, I'd go nuclear, gas, or follow the China model, if it's good enough for them, coal.
Okay. Okay. So what I've got here is energy efficiency, eliminate wind and solar, go for nuclear, gas, and coal. All right, the next one is Michael. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, as we've stated, I think we still need more information to really pin this down, but I'll certainly give my first shot, my first ideas. But I think one of the things that we need to remember in all this that I haven't heard enough of is that, you know, first and foremost, we have to meet our customer needs, and we have to make sure our system is reliable. You know, going back to some of these slides that we looked at where we had these risk points with wind and solar, while I strongly believe in wind and solar, we've got to realize that those risk points are there and have enough backup generation from other means to cover that, because battery technology, while it's improving, it's not quite there yet. So until we have those breakthroughs in battery technologies, you know, we have to make sure that we're prepared to generate enough electricity when we hit these risk points with wind and solar. That said, again, our first and foremost, we need to balance, you know, meet our customer needs and have reliable power. Obviously, we want to reduce pollution as much as possible, and we need to keep our rates affordable. There's lots of things that we can do if we're willing to throw lots of money at it, but you know, we have real people out there paying their bills, and we need to keep in mind that we need to continue to be an affordable utility. That said, looking at the next 7 years, I think we need to eliminate coal. We need to look at converting Spruce 2 to natural gas and then closing Spruce 1, therefore getting away from coal and reducing that more polluting form of energy. I think we need to close the Bronning 1, 2, and 3 plants. As was discussed, they're aging out. It's time to look at closing those in the next 7 years. I'd like to be able to say close Summers 1 and 2, but I think that we need to make sure we have replacement capacity before we close those. As it was discussed earlier, is that if we close that and expose ourselves to the market, we may not have that affordable energy for our customers. If we close too many things and we don't have the means to produce our own energy, rates could go skyrocketing just because we're, at the mercy of what ERCOT and the other providers are asking. So I would reserve judgment right now on Summers 1 and 2. But again, as I said, I'd close the Browning plants, convert Spruce 2 to natural gas, and then after that, close the Spruce 1 and get off of coal.
Okay, let me see if I got that. Okay, so keep a keen eye on customer demand, reliability, replace, reduce pollutants, keep it affordable, eliminate coal, convert Spruce 2, close Browning 1, 2, and 3, close Spruce 1, and then look at Summers 1 and 2 real carefully towards the end of the cycle. Okay, Anita? I'm sorry, not Anita, Anne Marie. I'm not looking very well today. I guess I'm tired. Go ahead.
Thank you, Reed.
I looked at you and just called you the wrong name.
It's okay. It happens.
It happens.
So before I comment on anything else, I'd like to go back to slide 3 and the projected population growth and the San Antonio metropolitan statistical area made up of 8 counties. Does CPS service customers in all of those 8 counties?
So our service territory, if you will, does include Bexar County and then portions of the surrounding counties.
Yes.
It does.
Okay, I have asked that question, but I have asked before, and I'm still waiting for that information about a comparison on costs in your service area, because I understand that you sell energy, and we take care of San Antonio, but then some of these other customers, maybe you're selling energy to a yet another party, or, just as a cost comparison to help keep an eye on costs for San Antonio. And I think the councilwoman's comment too on it's important to understand that you're looking at a larger service area than just San Antonio, portions of a multi-county service area, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And I'll save you some writing, Reed, because you can put me ×2 next to Peter.
Okay. All right.
But, however, I do have some other comments, and that is, you and I have talked before about on some of as we phase out these older plants, that they can maybe be retrofitted in some way even. I do think it's very, very important that we stay flexible. We do not know what's coming down the pike. We're only talking 7 years in our view. And I mean, I know how rapidly things, one of the things I say is I'm old enough to remember when the phone stayed on the wall, right? And now we're way beyond that. So things can change very quickly. In Europe, nuclear, I believe, and somebody correct me if I'm inaccurate, but last I was reading some things, nuclear in Europe is now or in the process of becoming classified as a renewable energy. So it's so important that we do stay flexible so that we can handle our money and be able to turn on a dime when we need to, because if we're stagnant, we're going to be hamstrung. Thank you.
Okay, I get, we really do need to look at this population. That's going to be a big variable for us. And it's going to have to relate to our population, as you say, and I totally agree with that. It would be helpful to have more pricing. For example, I've got a comment from Dana, and also I'd like to know what this last data point is on what we did on the solar. Now they'll say it's confidential because we said we wouldn't tell them, and we're competing. It's real hard for a municipal utility to say they're really competing. They price into a market, and they do a little bit, but so yes, we do need some better numbers on that. And stay flexible. Okay, did that kind of get it? And then I've got Peter's down, so I put P squared on yours. Okay. Jack?
I don't really have a a lot of comments, Reed. I'm looking forward to studying this some more. I kind of like the direction that they've laid out, and I'm just looking forward to see how that what they come back to us with. And like you said, cost of things and all that's going to be important to me.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Wayne? Turn your mic on, sorry.
I agree with most of the comments that I heard. The bottom line is flexibility. Unfortunately, when you start doing a study, you can set up points of consideration, but they're going to change by entity. So some items, number one is going to be affordability. Some items is going to be something else. So flexibility, I think we have a whole lot of items in there that we're not going to be able to cover all of the energy sources and stuff. So we're only talking 7 years. So we're going to have to me, narrow down something, and then affordability, flexibility, we had to go from there.
That's absolutely right. We've got, in the next 7 years, we've got limited options, but we need to know within a lot of sensitivity as to what those options can do for us and where we might get in trouble with them. And that's what we'll see. So this is a pretty structured and contained study. Thank you, Wayne. All right, Michael Sanchez.
Yes, thanks. I kind of agree right there with exactly what Wayne said. As far as this is only for 7 years, and so we don't want to hamstring ourselves into something that we have to orphan out later on. But going back to slide 17, the points of consideration, I'm still trying to understand. I really can't make a recommendation yet until I got a little bit more facts here. But I'm kind of inclined to go with natural gas just at this point. Affordability, yeah, I know we're going to expose ourselves to the market I'm using slide 17. We're going to expose ourselves to the market with affordability if we just go strictly natural gas. So we're going to have some sort of easily accessible and employable renewables right now in the next coming 7 years. The reliability and resiliency, yeah, that's a given. We got to have that. The environmental responsibility, though, as far as the CO2 gases, yeah, those are mandated that we've got to reduce CO2 emissions. But at the same time with environmental responsibility, we don't know, or perhaps maybe the science already is out there, if we're going to take on storage with these batteries, what's the toxic fallout from the batteries as they age out in what, 10 years, 20 years? I don't know about all that. So we need some more information on these storage systems, and maybe the toxic fallout from these batteries as we dispose them and put new batteries in. We just don't know enough about them at this point. But if the science does exist out there, well, let's hear it. Let's look for it. I will start looking for some of that stuff. And workforce impacts, as far as that criteria, that point of consideration. Are we assuming that when we say workforce impacts, the more people that are employed, the better, or are we saying perhaps less total payroll is better? Or I'm not sure what workforce impact.
Benny's coming up, Michael. Let him speak to that. He's the best
one.
one.
All right. Okay. I'll stand by.
Okay. Hi, Michael. So as we think about workforce impact, we have a standing workforce today that's skilled and capable of operating a lot of power plants. As we shut down power plants, then these jobs will go away in San Antonio. So that is a consideration for us as we work through this process. What we don't want to do is close things down prematurely and not be able to transition those people to other things if we're going to need them. It's very difficult to get a skilled workforce in this area capable of doing what they do in a timely manner. Change can occur quickly with jobs. Jobs go away, getting them back. So it's important for us as a utility to have a transition plan in which as we move to new technologies, we can move our people, shift them into those new technologies. So that is a consideration that we have as we work through this process.
Okay, thanks, Benny. Thanks for that good definition. I appreciate that. So these points of considerations, if we can get some sort of some definitions for what we mean, and are we going to put these these points of consideration in a decision matrix, and the RAC is going to weight them, rank order them? So when we take a look at all these other means of generation, we will know what the pros and cons are, and we'll be able to put some sort of apply some academic rigor to our recommendation to the Board of Trustees. If we're going to put kind of weight these, which one is more important than the other one, or which one weighs less. Just checking on that. I really can't make a recommendation right now on which way I'd like to go, but I'm inclined to go with natural gas.
All right. Well, no, we understand. And again, there will be other assumptions besides this, and it's like anything else. We'll find some assumptions that are very sensitive, and we'll find some assumptions that have a pretty wide dispersion without having much effect on the decision. So then we'll typically home in on the ones that are very sensitive and try to improve that estimates, or at least know that that's something we have to watch in doing that. That's a good point, Michael.
That's all I have. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Sure. I got flexibility, natural gas, reliability, affordability, storage, risk in battery, toxic waste. Dee Dee, you're on.
Okay. First, I think I just want to kind of recap what I've said before. I've made recommendations on like what I would like to see for Spruce, the gas plants, whichever. I think we should be making recommendations on assumptions and criteria for evaluating scenarios, as well as existing baseline policy commitments, like the goals of the cap. I think we need to transition to clean energy. My recommendations included assumptions and inputs. So y'all have seen that already. I've listed out criteria for evaluation. I think that we should have some open conversations about whatever suggested scenarios other REC members have, maybe 10 of them to run through full modeling. That should include all clean energy resources, distributed energy resources, rooftop solar, batteries, energy efficiency, and demand response. And I would also like, when we do start running the modeling, that we run a model many times to account for variations in future weather, energy prices, and demand. And those are my comments.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Oh, we appreciate getting those in advance. Christopher?
Once again, I really appreciate the data. Please keep it coming. And if we go back to the very beginning of this particular presentation, on a couple of pages, just for reference, page 4 is very instructive in reminding us that we have seen substantial changes in our portfolio over the decades. And I think that, that should be a pretty safe assumption that that kind of trend will continue. So we don't necessarily know what the percentages are going to be, but we've seen that change. It will probably continue. And if anything, we are noticing that the diversification is insulating us against some of the price shocks when surprises happen, and we should be anticipating more volatility and shocks. So diversity is a great way to go on this. If anything, at the moment, gas is 46%, so that's a vulnerability. How we decide to ramp down from that is something we can have conversations about. But as we saw during the winter storm, whether it was actual supply or prices on the open market or the rest, certain things like that during a shock can really affect operations. And it doesn't take a lot of extreme events to really hit the bottom line. The numbers I'm remembering, there were roughly about $418 million worth of legitimate charges that CPS has for more or less adopted, and the litigation was around 587 million. You can do a lot with the $587 million. So if we have similar price shocks in the future, you know, instead of exposing ourselves to those risks, you know, what investments can we make strategically so that instead of money out the door, we have capacity of our own to deal with that, and maybe if there is excess capacity, make some revenue off of that. Going back to the previous slide on, I think it was number 3, I'm always curious to see what we can learn from history, especially recent history. And it's nice to see what the projected annual demand is going to be moving forward of 95 megawatts. I would be curious if we could dig a little deeper into these numbers. You know, was that steady over the last 10 to 15 years or not? And if it wasn't, what were the trigger points that caused the volatility, either up or down? And it would be nice to see the historical data that shows how, you know, the STEP program, for instance, affected what, say, in 2010 had been the expected demand in 2022 versus our actual demand today, and how perhaps step 2 can affect that moving forward, so that we can see the actual correlation and the interactions there. And I want to go back to this notion of efficiency and conservation, because it does give us this capacity to have breathing room, breathing space, so we don't make these, you know, multi-year or multi-decade investments if we don't have to. You know, delay is a wonderful tactic in some cases. You know, delaying your taxes is great, and in this case, delaying our expenses in terms of major capital investments would be great, because some of these technologies are evolving rapidly. You know, you look at solar the last 15 years. It's been tremendous, both in terms of you know, the availability and the efficiency. You know, what are the projected efficiencies going forward? That's hard to know. And this goes back to the historical data. I would be curious if we could unearth some documents from, say, 2010 or during a last major planning process when capital investments were anticipated, and see what the projections were going forward up to the present, and see how actual market forces and other events have affected that, whether that was changes in the price of coal and the price of solar, of wind. And I think if anything else, that could serve as a reminder to us of the volatility out there that we are not going to be able to anticipate. We know what's going to be there, we just don't know what in the next 5 to 7 years. And seeing some of that would help us be mindful that there will be perhaps wonderful new technologies, but also some other potential price shocks. And keeping that in mind, I think, will be very, very helpful for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Having spent about 35 years in a pretty volatile environment, we will for sure plan those in. And you know, just in the time I've been dealing with CPS, it's gone from 835, you know, down to 3 or 4 and back up. So we'll schedule those in, and if you want to look at some historical data, then please get with them and do that.
Could I have one additional
Yeah,
insight real quick?
sure.
So you brought up a really good point. Slide 4 here. I want you to take a look at that for just a second. Anne Marie actually reminded me of this when she talked about the phone that hung on the wall. So about 1978, Congress put a law in place. You could not build more gas plants. And they did that because of high gas prices and the impact it was having on the economy. They said you must diversify. TVA, for example, launched a program to build a lot of nuclear units, just like they'd seen France and Spain do overseas, and coal became the bridge fuel. And that's why coal was built, because you could build them very quickly, and they were effective, and the fuel was really, really cheap. You look at our migration. We're in the middle. We're starting a Herculean effort here. Change is hard. Look how far, look what it took to get to a little coal. Look where our nuclear kicked in. Change is hard. You're right. We've got to look at the data. We've got to build on the tried and true. And this is where the challenge comes in. And this is why your help is so important to us. It's hard to make that shift. Look at where we're still at on natural gas. And the reason we're still there is because it's economical. There's a great distribution system in place and it's very flexible. The equipment is cheap. It's easy to maintain, relatively easy to maintain. That's why it's there. It's back to affordability. That's our challenge. That's what we got to work through. As I think about natural gas, I think hydrogen, ammonia, there's conversion opportunities, different things we can burn in those machines just with a fuel system modification. But this is where we need your help, is sorting this plan out and balancing all of these things. But I just wanted you to look at this slide and think about how long it's taking us to do things. We've got to have a plan pretty darn quick, December, for the next 7 years. We got a lot of work to do. We don't have a lot of time to do it in.
That's exactly right. And Christopher, we can go back and we can start really in August of 71 with Nixon and wage and price controls. Then we can move through October of 73 with the embargo, and we can keep going. I've been through peak oil and I've been through oil's going to be here forever. So totally, it's a very movable deal. And we can talk about that for sure. Now we've got Femi. Are you on, Femi, or do I need to read your comments?
I'm here. I actually
Okay.
was timing you. I was actually timing you because I've gotten to a place known as Tesla Drive, and I thought I might just park and take a look at what's going on around here. So I'm parked and I'm ready to talk.
All right, go. You're on.
I think, as I said, I'm very happy that that the issues of uncertainty and risk have been included in the proposed modeling process. Just as we've said, sensitivity analysis is necessary, but along with that will come the need to look at those uncertainties. Can we define a ballpark that would provide all those parameters, safety, environmental, responsibility, affordability, all those measures that we've talked about are essentially going to be the dimensions along which we will look at whatever the future plan would be. But to be able to define a ballpark around those options is very essential. And I think the way to go through it is with sensitivity, uncertainty, and also understanding the risks that are involved with the ultimate decisions. So that was my written comment to read. But my other comment was informed by two recent conferences that I've attended. One was COP26. And regarding fuel choice, it was very clear at COP26 that coal was the sole culprit. And natural gas, I think, got a pass because it's still considered a transition fuel, and that is simply where the world sees it right now. Renewables are in the picture, but the sole culprit in COP26 was coal. So looking at what plans, how our plans would evolve, the plans, that is the generation planning and the plans we have in CPS Energy's portfolio right now, I would say get rid of the coal plants first before getting rid of the old plants. I hope you know the difference. Coal plants first, old plants next. And that is leading me to the second conference that I attended, which is actually the one I'm just coming from in Dallas, Power Chain 2022. I believe I may have spotted one or two of your CPS Energy's senior staff in the conference as well. There's some new technologies that are emerging, and those technologies have to be applied, and we have to consider them as things that may not emerge in the next 8-10 years, but will come of age perhaps in the next 15 or 20, 25 years. And the issue is we should not put ourselves into a position where we are automatically foreclosing the ability to use those new technologies. Reed mentioned ammonia, which is something that I actually had a chance to speak to a few experts from Korea and Japan just at this conference, and they are looking at those issues of easy transportability for ammonia relative to oxygen, to hydrogen. But they also have opportunities, I think, for pilot testing, which is something that we may be able to do in the next 5-8 years, even though we're not ready to switch the fuel. Can we test and do some pilot programming, pilot schemes whereby we actually test the ability to switch fuels from natural gas to ammonia in the same units? I mean, those are studies that are going on right now that I've just learned about. you guys may know about it already, but it's amazing to realize that we can test things out even though we have not built them. And because there's the possibility that things like ammonia could be burned in the same units, the same burners as natural gas, we may have an opportunity to do things like that without essentially foreclosing the opportunity to use those new technologies when they emerge, because we've been able to test them during this, what I call the transition period of 5 to 8 years before the end of the decade. So those are my comments. As I said, get rid of the coal plants first, and then the old plants next, and look at opportunities to pilot test some of these new technologies within the context of our existing technologies, because they might still be adaptable in the new era, so to speak. Thank you.
I think we all see Spruce One as a really good possibility to test a lot of new technologies, but I'll let the guys that actually do it talk about that later, because we do have some opportunities there. Okay, and Anita, and then I need to talk about give Dana's comments. So Anita, please start.
Great, thank you. Again, thank you so much, Kevin and everybody for their comments. I want to go back to this slide 17, if we can. So, for me, the comments that I want to make are really about the assumptions behind capacity planning. And, I understand that, we're looking at population growth. We talked about our generation transformation that needs to happen. But I mentioned the weather, the need for us to improve our future cast because of the more days of higher heat. So that, again, I want to have a little bit more of a specific conversation around that, and if that's baked into the model. But the other point I want to talk about is, and I really see both of those two things as almost a fatal flaw, if you will. And that one is that the weather, and the second is the electrification of vehicles. Now, I know that we're talking over the next 7 years, and then on the biggest end, looking at 25. Well, it is, and as CPS Energy knows, it has already begun. And what's happening first is the fleet vehicles being converted, and then trucks, large trucks. Those things are going to come probably faster than the rate of change of every person that's driving a car being able to switch them out. So we're going to have very intense users in a very small area. And so when we look out over the next 7 years, I mean, I just feel like, is that baked into this? I guess this is my question for Kevin. Is it baked in? And because I really feel like, again, the more extreme heat, more days of higher heat over the next 7 years. And then second is that the electrification of large trucks and fleet vehicles, that is going to be a huge thing. So when we start forecasting what our capacity, or we start capacity planning, I feel like those two pieces I want to see, are they baked into our assumptions?
So good question. I think so 2 points on the weather. The base load forecast, if you will, that we will put into the model, I think will still be based on normalized weather, the average weather. The more extreme weather, I think, would come into play as more of a sensitivity, where we're looking at what happens if we have those higher load, more extreme scenarios. On the electrification of vehicles, we do have built into our forecast, we do assume some level of electrification. I will have to check with our experts who have put together that forecast to see the details on what we're assuming as far as truck and fleet electrification.
I have a clarification question, just last part, because what I understand right now is that, we have, 7,300 plus megawatts of capacity right now. We know that we talk about the generation transformation that we're going to have to phase out and replace about 3,000 megawatts over the next several years. And then back from slide 3, we talked about that 1 million people coming to San Antonio over the next, several decades. So we're planning 95 megawatt growth per year. And yeah, that is, if we can get back to me on that, I do want to know what that percentage increase like over time is over the next 7 years, if that makes sense.
Anita, that's really important. And from my concern, it follows a little bit on yours. Some of these variables, when you move them, they don't just move that variable, they affect another variable. So there's secondary effects. And I think that's what you're getting to. When the weather changes, it doesn't just change the demand, it might change the mix that we need to use for our generation. So there's a lot of multiple effects that spin off of a change, and we have to be able to understand those. You're exactly right. I totally agree. Anything else, Anita?
No, I just, wanted to kind of like point that out, that
Yeah.
I believe that there is a fatal flaw in our proposed modeling process, and it is those two things. And not just the extreme weather, I'm talking about the higher average weather. So, so those will be interesting conversations moving forward, but thank you.
Right, but the way you take care of a flaw is you usually run various sensitivities in all directions so you can see a pattern of what happens there. So I think we should be able to take care of that with just the way we run options or sensitivities. Just a couple of questions. Is that it, Anita? I don't want to cut you off.
No, that was it. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Yeah. Okay. Dana had 3 points. He's very concerned about continuing with any solar, the price and availability and the distribution and the distribution, not just distribution, more the transmission cost and bottlenecks. And so I think we need to all recognize that concern. He wants more explanation on ancillary services, so we'll send another thing on that. He has a similar concern I have, that we're going to have to make some assumptions about how ERCOT's going to come down between a capacity market and an energy-only market. If we continue to stay in one of those two extremes and we're playing soccer and football on the same field, it's going to be way different than if ERCOT does flip over and require everybody to have some capacity. And back to those utilization factors, there's several studies that have been done as to how we would count solar, wind, natural gas. They even get to the detail of if you have stored natural gas with a gas unit, that gets a higher rating or a higher utilization factor than if you don't have the natural gas, to several points made here. So we need to look at where Texas is going, because like it or not, we're part of ERCOT. All right, let's circle back. Anakwa had another point, and then I think, unless I hear something from somebody else, we'll be.
I have another point. I have a point to make afterwards, Reed. This is Adelita Cantu.
Oh, yeah, okay. I hear these voices, and I don't want to think I can't sometimes recognize. Sorry. Yeah, we'll take Anakwa, and then we'll have Dr. Cantu. Go ahead.
Thank you. So in terms of renewable energy, I think you may classify nuclear power and geothermal as renewable. However, they do have effects. Nuclear power creates radioactive waste. Geothermal engineering potentially could put waterways at risk, causes small earthquakes, just to name a few things that come from that. So if you are a big proponent of these, I'm assuming you're okay living across a nuclear facility, having nuclear waste stored right by your home. If not, then nuclear facilities are built further away. I think there's one in South Texas. So then we're creating what is called a sacrifice zone, because in the event of something terrible happening at a nuclear facility or a geothermal site, we are far enough to not be affected. And so by advocating for these, you're actively advocating for sacrifice zones, which largely tend to be Black, Indigenous, people of color zones. And I know that there is some legislation where nuclear waste is wanting to be disposed of in parts of Indian country. Don't know the specifics, I think Wyoming. And so I think we need to be really careful about what the impact of our choices have if it's not here where these pollutions may potentially end up in. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Dr. Cantu.
Thank you. Three things. One is, I think earlier in the presentation, CPS mentioned that there was a book on generation planning they had sent to everyone, or everybody got a copy of. I haven't, but since I just joined, so I was wanting to see if I can get a copy of that. And number two, I think it does have to related to what Anakwa was saying. So certainly I want to see the coal plants close as soon as they possibly can, just not only because of the environmental benefit, but certainly the health benefits as well. How it aligns with the cap. And a lot of the cap is equity. And how do we think about climate adaptation equitably? And so I think that's a key component as well as we plan for the future, is the equitable nature of what we do discuss. And then that leads me to three, I think also in our planning, is at every step of the way, the community needs to be involved and not necessarily brought along, but be a partner in the discussions we have about what we're going to be doing in the next 7 to 8 years. So those were my couple of things, and then just a request for the book. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I brought that to you when we first met, but we'll get you another copy right out. Thank you. Okay. Looking around, not hearing anything, not seeing anything, so I think we're done. Appreciate it. Really appreciate the help today. Thank you.